The sun was just a sliver on the horizon when we drove into Ashen Creek. The desert swallowed the road behind us, endless and barren, a flat expanse of cracked earth and lifeless brush stretching into the distance. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten by time, dead long before we arrived. Dust swirled across the road, rising in thin streams like ghosts trying to escape the earth. I hadn't spoken in hours. None of us had. The closer we got to the town, the heavier the air became, as if something unseen was pushing against us. The sign at the edge of the town was barely legible. Its wood splintered, the paint peeled away. Ashen Creek. Population 0.I. Someone had scrawled the 0 in thick, jagged lines, as though they wanted to make sure no one missed it. Beyond the sign, the town rose out of the earth like a mirage. Low buildings slouched against one another, their facades cracked and faded from years under the brutal desert sun. Windows stared back at us, dark and empty, their glass shattered or missing altogether. The silence here was so deep it pressed against my ears, broken only by the soft hum of the engine. We parked in what might have once been the town square, though now it was nothing but dust and ruin. A dried-up fountain sat in the center, its stone figures eroded into faceless shapes. The air smelled like rusted iron and old wood, sharp and wrong, like something decaying just out of sight. I stepped out of the vehicle, my boots crunching against gravel and bone-dry earth. The sound seemed too loud. I glanced at the others. Sarah and Elias were unloading their gear from the back, and Leah stood near the edge of the square, staring down a long, empty street that disappeared into a haze of heat and dust. The town felt wrong. I couldn't put it into words, but there was something about the place that made my skin prickle. It wasn't just the abandonment or the rot. It was the stillness, the kind of quiet that wasn't natural, as though everything in the world had stopped here and refused to start again. "This place is dead," I muttered under my breath, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince myself or the others. Leah's voice came from somewhere to my left. "No, it's waiting." I turned to look at her. She hadn't moved, her body still as stone, her gaze locked on the horizon where the buildings ended and the desert swallowed everything. Her face was pale, her eyes narrowed slightly, like she could see something I couldn't. A shiver crawled up my spine despite the heat. Leah had always been the quiet one, stoic, logical. But something about the way she said that made my throat dry out. Elias called us back, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. He'd found the nexus point, as he called it, a tear in the ground near the fountain, just as his readings had suggested. I walked over to where he stood, crouching beside a fissure in the earth. It stretched for yards in either direction, jagged and raw, the soil around it blackened as though it had been scorched. I leaned closer, peering into the darkness below. The crack was deeper than it looked. From this angle, it seemed endless, the shadows devouring the light of the setting sun. Elias knelt beside me, his handheld scanner beeping softly as he waved it over the fissure. "The readings are off the charts," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't place. Excitement, maybe, or fear. "Seismic activity this high shouldn't be possible without a fault line. But there's something moving down there. Do you hear it?" I froze, holding my breath. At first, I heard nothing, just the sound of the wind, thin and weak as it whistled through the abandoned buildings. Then I heard it, a faint thrum, deep and rhythmic, like something breathing far below us. My heart skipped a beat, and I pulled back instinctively, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. "It's probably just shifting sediment," Elias said, though his voice wavered. "The earth settling after the last quake," but I knew he was wrong. It didn't sound like sediment. It sounded alive. The sun was gone now, replaced by a gray, lifeless dusk that bled over the town. Shadows pooled at the edges of the square, crawling up the sides of the buildings like ink. Leah stood near one of the structures, staring at something on the ground. I crossed the square to join her, my footsteps strangely muffled, the air growing colder. She didn't look up when I approached. "Leah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She pointed. I followed her finger and felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. Scattered across the ground were bones, hundreds of them. They were small, brittle, some cracked in half, others almost perfectly intact. At first I thought they might have been animal remains, but as I knelt and picked one up, I realized the truth. It was a human finger bone, bleached white and cold to the touch. My breath caught, and I dropped it immediately, wiping my hands on my jeans as though I could scrub away the feeling. Where did these come from? I muttered, mostly to myself. Leah didn't answer. She was staring past me now, her face pale, her eyes wide. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my chest. At the edge of the square, just beyond the buildings where the desert stretched into nothingness, something moved. It was just a flicker at first, a ripple of darkness, like heat distortion. But then it stepped closer, and I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, its body unnaturally elongated, its arms hanging too low, its fingers dragging through the dust. Its face was hidden, nothing but shadow where features should have been. But I could feel it watching me, staring through the hollow void where its eyes should have been. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, still as death. I stumbled back, my pulse thundering in my ears. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. No. The others were gathering around, their eyes darting between me and the thing in the shadows. But when we turned back to the fissure, it was different. The ground had split wider, deeper, and the sound, the breathing, was louder now, rising from below, a heavy guttural rhythm that set my teeth on edge. Then, the whispering started. It came from everywhere. From the fissure, from the shadows, from the wind itself. The voices layered over each other, too many to count, speaking in a language I didn't understand, but still felt deep in my chest. The figure at the edge of the square began to move, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. Sarah screamed. The ground shook violently, the fissure cracking wider as the earth beneath us gave way. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed us was the figure, standing perfectly still, its hollow face staring back at me. And then we fell. The fall had knocked the breath out of me, leaving only pain and ringing silence in its wake. Dust settled slowly, drifting through the air like ash as I pushed myself upright, wincing at the sting in my ribs. My flashlight flickered weakly in the dirt nearby, its beam trembling in the heavy darkness. For a long moment I sat still, trying to piece together what had just happened. The ground had given way beneath us, opening like a trapdoor into something far older and far darker than I could imagine. Daniel, where are you?" Leah's voice was faint, tight with panic, but it cut through the haze clouding my mind. I grabbed the flashlight, its light shaking as I turned toward the sound. She was a few feet away, crouched low, her face pale in the glow of her own light. Her hands trembled as she scanned the cavern around us. The walls stretched impossibly high into shadow, their surfaces rough and uneven. My flashlight caught faint patterns in the stone, lines and shapes that seemed too deliberate to be natural. "I'm here," I managed to croak, coughing dust from my lungs. "Where are the others?" "Here," came another voice, followed by the sound of shifting rubble. Sarah appeared from the gloom, brushing dirt from her clothes and clutching at a cut on her forehead. Elias was right behind her, his face pale and drawn. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, his voice tight, though he already knew the answer. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned my flashlight downward, sweeping the beam over the cavern floor. It was uneven and littered with debris, the air cold and damp, carrying a faint scent that made the back of my throat tighten, like metal left out in the rain. But it wasn't just dirt and stone beneath us. Scattered across the ground, half buried in the dust, were shapes, fragments of things that didn't belong. My light froze on something small and pale. I didn't want to believe it, but as I knelt to look closer, the truth was undeniable. It was a bone. The others saw it too. Leah let out a sharp breath, her flashlight darting over the ground to reveal more. Ribs, femurs, vertebrae, all broken and scattered like discarded refuse. Some were small, fragile, others far too large. Sarah swore under her breath, stumbling back. This isn't right," Elias whispered. He was staring at the cavern walls now, his beam catching more of the strange patterns carved into the stone. "Do you see this? These aren't just cracks. These are markings." I followed his gaze. The carvings stretched across every surface. Lines and grooves etched deep into the rock, intersecting to form patterns that pulsed faintly under the flashlight's glare. I felt sick looking at them, like my mind couldn't fully grasp their design. They weren't words, not exactly, but they meant something. Something I didn't want to understand. And then, I heard it. A faint sound rising from somewhere deep within the cavern. Low and rhythmic. Like the beat of a distant drum, or a pulse from beneath the earth. It started small, barely noticeable. But as I focused, it seemed to vibrate through the ground, rattling the air, the rock, and the space inside my chest. "Do you hear that?" Leah's voice trembled. The others nodded, their faces pale and strained. Elias stepped forward, his flashlight fixed on a narrow opening in the cavern wall. A tunnel carved into the rock, its entrance framed by even more of the strange symbols. The sound was coming from there, growing louder with every second, beckoning us closer. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said sharply, glancing back the way we came. "Find another way up. That tunnel is a death trap." "There's no way back," Elias replied, his voice quiet but firm. He pointed at the ceiling above us, where jagged cracks stretched across the stone like veins. The ground collapsed behind us. "The only way out is forward." The whispering began softly, curling through the air like mist. At first I thought it was the wind, filtering through cracks in the stone, but it was too deliberate. The voices were layered, soft and overlapping. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in tones that made my skin crawl. I felt it inside me, like fingers trailing along my spine, and I could tell the others felt it too. "We're not alone down here," Leah whispered. No one argued. Elias stepped toward the tunnel, the beam of his flashlight barely piercing the heavy dark. I hesitated, my body screaming at me to turn back, to find some other way. But instinct told me there was nothing behind us anymore, only the void, and whatever had been waiting in it. We followed him. The tunnel closed around us almost immediately, the walls pressing tight, the air colder with every step. The whispering grew louder, bouncing off the stone, the rhythm of the pulse beneath us quickening. I felt like I was moving deeper into something living, something breathing. My flashlight flickered, and my heart jumped. For a second, I thought I saw something move, a shadow pulling itself along the wall, just beyond the light's reach. "Keep going," Elias called back, though his voice was quieter now, the confidence in it faltering. We pressed on. The tunnel twisted and turned, the carvings growing more elaborate, glowing faintly as though lit from within. I tried not to look at them. The longer I stared, the more they seemed to shift, their shapes twisting like they were alive, whispering things just beyond my hearing. The tunnel opened suddenly into a massive chamber. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping over the space. The ceiling disappeared into blackness, and the walls were covered, every inch, with symbols carved into the stone. At the center of the room stood an altar. It was massive and jagged, its surface slick with something dark that pooled in grooves leading outward like veins. The pulse was deafening here, vibrating through the air, the ground, my chest. Leah's flashlight trembled in her hand as she whispered, "This isn't natural. This isn't real." But it was. The whispering turned into a roar, louder, clearer, as something shifted in the shadows beyond the altar. I froze, the beam of my light catching movement. A figure, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its body barely solid, as it folded itself forward. It wasn't walking. It was crawling, pulling itself across the ground with sharp, jerking motions. Elias stumbled back, his voice catching in his throat. What is that?" It lifted its head. There was no face, just darkness, deep and endless. But I felt it looking at me. A cold, sharp pull sank into my chest, dragging me forward as the whispering turned into words I still couldn't understand. My legs locked, my breath shallow, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. "Run!" I choked out. The thing moved, faster than it had any right to, and the room exploded into chaos. The chamber erupted into chaos as the figure lunged forward, its limbs twisting unnaturally, pulling it across the floor faster than I could react. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam scattering wildly across the walls, catching glimpses of symbols pulsing red, of stone slick with black streaks that shouldn't have been there. The air was alive now, vibrating with that deafening pulse. Thump, 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 like the earth itself had a heartbeat. "Move." Elias' voice ripped through the roar, breaking me free. My legs finally obeyed, and I turned, grabbing Leah's arm as we bolted toward the tunnel. The thing shrieked behind us, a sound that wasn't human, wasn't animal, just wrong. It was high and sharp, a sound that seemed to stab into my brain and claw its way down my spine. I didn't dare look back. My mind refused to piece together what I'd seen. Its long, skeletal limbs, its faceless head tilting toward us like it could see even without eyes. The way it moved, pulling itself along the ground, its body flickering like it was struggling to hold its shape, was something no living thing should do. Leah stumbled as we ran, her boots skidding on the uneven stone. I grabbed her waist, yanking her upright, adrenaline turning my hands into steel. Ahead of us, Sarah and Elias were already in the tunnel, their flashlights bobbing erratically as they sprinted forward. I could hear it, that thing, scraping across the stone behind us. Its movements uneven but relentless, the whispering growing louder and louder, until it drowned out the blood pounding in my ears. We reached the tunnel's entrance, and for a split second, I thought we'd make it. I was wrong. The tunnel shifted. It was subtle at first, like the walls trembled in place. But then it wasn't. The carvings on the stone began to writhe and twist, pulling apart like veins tearing open. The ground buckled beneath my feet, the pulse growing stronger, matching the rhythm of my panicked heartbeat. I forced Leah into the tunnel, her flashlight spinning wildly as she stumbled forward. "Go! Keep moving!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. Behind me the shriek came again, closer now. I turned my head just enough to see it. The figure was pulling itself toward the tunnel, faster now, its limbs snapping as it crawled. My flashlight caught its face, or where a face should have been, just for a moment. There was nothing there, just darkness, endless and hollow, pulling me in like a black hole. My stomach dropped, my chest clenched. Then the tunnel collapsed behind us. Stone shattered, chunks of rock raining down, and I flung myself forward, landing hard against the ground. Dust filled the air, choking me as I crawled on hands and knees, my lungs burning. I turned my head just in time to see the entrance to the chamber seal itself shut, a deep, echoing boom vibrating through the earth. The pulse stopped. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of our gasping breaths and the soft clatter of loose rocks settling. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak, but enough to show me the others. Sarah had collapsed against the tunnel wall, coughing into her elbow. Leah sat on the ground, her back against the stone, her eyes wide, her face pale as a ghost. Elias was pacing, his flashlight bouncing off the narrow walls, his face pinched with terror. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice raw. No one answered. I didn't think any of us could. I sat up slowly, my ribs aching with every movement. The tunnel stretched ahead of us, narrow and unyielding, disappearing into the black. Behind us, there was nothing, just solid stone where the entrance to the chamber had been. It was like the earth had decided to close itself off, to trap us down here with whatever we had woken up. Leah broke the silence. It was watching us. Her voice trembled, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked afraid. She wasn't wrong. I had felt it too. The weight of that thing's gaze, pulling at me, drawing me toward it like I was little more than a fly caught in a web. My skin prickled at the memory, my chest tightening, as though the air was still pressing down on me. "It's not just the sinkhole," Elias said. his voice low. "This isn't a natural formation. The symbols, this place, it's been here for centuries, maybe longer." Sarah shook her head, gripping her flashlight tightly. "Then what is it? What's down here?" No one wanted to say the truth aloud. That we didn't know. That there are things buried beneath the earth, forgotten by time, ignored by history, that should never have been found. The pulse was still in my chest. Faint now, like an echo that refused to fade. It was alive, whatever it was, and it wanted us here. "We need to keep moving," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "There's no way back. If we stop here, we're done." Elias nodded, his expression grim. He started forward, his flashlight cutting through the black, the beam wobbling against the uneven walls. One by one, we followed. The tunnel stretched on forever, its ceiling so low in places that we had to crouch, its walls so narrow they pressed against our shoulders. The air grew colder as we moved, colder and wetter, until every breath felt like ice against my throat. I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen back there. How it moved, how it sounded. I could still hear it, even now. The scrape of its limbs, the hiss of its breath, the whisper of its voice curling through the dark. "Do you hear that?" Leah's whisper broke the silence. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. At first there was nothing, just the faint echo of our footsteps. But then I heard it, a faint sound drifting through the tunnel ahead. Drip, bite. Drip, bite. Drip, bite. It was water, or something that sounded like water. Elias moved faster, and we followed, the sound growing louder with each step. The tunnel widened suddenly, opening into a cavern, smaller than the first, but no less unsettling. The air was colder here, thick with mist that coiled around my ankles. At the center of the room, a pool of dark liquid reflected our flashlight beams like black glass. It wasn't water. The surface rippled as we approached, the sound of dripping echoing from somewhere deep within it. The carvings covered the cavern walls again, glowing faintly now, pulsing in time with the ripples spreading across the pool. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. Elias knelt by the edge, his face lit by the faint glow. "It's coming from here, the pulse, the sound, everything." He reached out as though to touch the surface, and a sharp panic seized me. "Don't!" I shouted. It was too late. The pool moved. The ripples exploded outward, and something rose from the center, dragging itself free of the liquid. It wasn't the figure from before. It was bigger, its shape shifting and flickering, limbs unraveling like smoke, its hollow face staring at us from across the cavern. The whispering returned, louder than ever, echoing through my skull until it was all I could hear. I grabbed Leah's arm, pulling her back as the thing moved closer, its form stretching, the pool churning around it. "We need to go," I shouted. Elias stumbled back, his face white as the pool began to boil. The ground shook, the whispers turning into a roar as the thing reached for us. And then we ran. The roar behind us was like an avalanche, a deep, guttural sound that shook the walls and vibrated through my bones. We stumbled over uneven ground, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran, the beam of light barely cutting through the dense mist curling out of the pool. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, the wet, slithering sound of something dragging itself free from that dark liquid. The whispering had returned, louder now, curling through the air like smoke, its voices layered and broken. The tunnel twisted ahead, shrinking so tight in places we had to duck low and scramble on all fours. The stone was damp and freezing under my palms, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between us and the thing that had risen. Elias was ahead of me, his breathing ragged, his flashlight beam swaying wildly. Behind me, Leah followed close, her hand clutching the back of my jacket so tightly it felt like her nails might tear through the fabric. Sarah brought up the rear, her light flickering as she stumbled and cursed, her voice shaking with panic. "We can't keep running." Sarah's voice cracked behind me, her words broken by gasps for breath. Where are we even going? I don't know. I yelled over my shoulder, the words bouncing off the walls, returning as faint whispers. I could hear the panic in my own voice, rising like bile. Just keep moving. The tunnel finally widened again, spilling us into another cavern. I skidded to a stop, nearly losing my footing as the floor sloped downward. Elias was already there, his flashlight sweeping across the space, his eyes wide with disbelief. The cavern was massive, far larger than the last, its ceiling lost to the darkness above, but it wasn't empty. At the center, rising out of the stone like the roots of some ancient tree, stood a structure. A monolith carved from the same dark rock as the altar. It pulsed faintly in the light, the carvings on its surface glowing red, as though something beneath it was alive. The pattern spread outward across the cavern floor, etched deep into the stone, leading into dark tunnels on the far side. Leah's voice was barely a whisper. "What is that?" Elias stumbled forward, his flashlight trembling as he raised it toward the monolith. "It's ancient, older than anything we've ever seen." His voice was tight with awe and fear, his words trailing off as he stepped closer. This shouldn't exist." I couldn't take my eyes off it. The glow from the carving seemed to pulse in time with the thrum in the air, the same rhythmic beat we'd heard since we fell into this place. It was stronger now, vibrating through my chest, through my skull, drowning out my thoughts. My flashlight wavered as I scanned the base of the monolith, and that's when I saw them. Figures. Not alive, not moving, statues, dozens of them, hunched and twisted as though they'd been frozen mid-scream. Their bodies were human, but wrong. Limbs elongated, faces stretched into grotesque expressions of terror. Their eyes, if they could even be called that, were hollow, deep pits carved into their skulls. Some were clutching their heads, their hands frozen over their ears, while others were reaching toward the monolith, as though drawn to it before they were turned to stone. "Don't touch it!" I shouted at Elias as he approached. My voice echoed back at me, too loud, too sharp. Elias froze mid-step, turning to look at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "It's calling to us," he said softly, almost dreamlike. "Don't you feel it? It's like it's alive. It doesn't want us here." Leah snapped, her voice breaking. "Elias, we need to leave. Now." But he wasn't listening. He took another step toward the monolith, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was fighting against an invisible force. The pulse in the air quickened. The whispers grew louder, threading through my mind, overlapping into a discordant chant that made my vision blur. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the ground, my hands pressed against the stone as I tried to drown them out. Leah screamed, her voice sharp in panic. "Elias!" I looked up, just in time to see it. The monolith flared brighter, its glow spilling outward in waves. The air around it rippled like heat rising off asphalt, distorting everything it touched. Elias froze mid-step, his face lit by the red glow, his eyes wide with something between terror and awe. The whispers turned into a roar, vibrating through the cavern, shaking the walls. The statues moved. At first, it was just a flicker, a shift in the shadows, but then they twitched. Their hollow eyes turned toward Elias, their limbs creaking, as they began to pull themselves free from the stone. I couldn't move. I could only watch as they unfolded, their bodies twisting unnaturally, their mouths stretching open in silent screams. Elias turned to run, but it was too late. One of them reached him, its arm snapping outward like a whip, its fingers wrapping around his shoulder. He screamed, a sound I'll never forget, as the statue's grip tightened, pulling him toward the monolith. The glow flared brighter, and for a split second, Elias' face twisted in agony before he went still. The light swallowed him, and then he was gone. The statues turned toward us, their hollow faces blank, their bodies jerking as they moved. Leah grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet. "Daniel, run!" We bolted for the nearest tunnel, Sarah's flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of us. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them, Stone feet scraping against stone, the whispering growing louder, following us through the dark. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls narrowing again, pressing in close. My lungs burned, my muscles screaming with every step, but we didn't stop. Keep going. I choked out, my voice breaking. Don't stop. The ground trembled beneath us, the pulse still there, still stronger, matching the frantic pounding of my heart. The whispering turned into something else now. Laughter, faint and broken, drifting through the air like smoke, curling around me as we ran. We burst into another chamber, smaller this time, and collapsed against the far wall. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my flashlight shaking as I swept it across the room. There were no statues here, no carvings, just bare stone and silence. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her face buried in her hand. Leah sat beside me, her arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly as she whispered under her breath, "Where's Elias?" Sarah's voice was muffled, broken. I didn't answer, because I knew the truth. Elias was gone, swallowed by whatever lived inside the monolith, just like those statues. Those things had been before him. The pulse still throbbed in the air, faint now, but ever present, like it was waiting, watching, and I knew it wouldn't stop until it had all of us. The silence in the chamber pressed against me like a weight, heavy and suffocating. I could still hear the faint echo of Elias's scream in my head, replaying over and over until it felt like it was stitched into my thought. The monolith's red glow had seared itself behind my eyes. Every time I blinked, I saw it pulsing in the dark, like some twisted beacon. Sarah's sobs were faint, muffled by her hands as she knelt on the floor, her body trembling with every breath. Leah sat next to me, her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them, as though she could hold herself together through sheer force. Her lips moved soundlessly, whispering something I couldn't hear. A prayer, maybe. Or maybe just pleading for this nightmare to end. I leaned my head back against the cold stone wall, forcing myself to breathe through the knot in my chest. My flashlight sat beside me, its beam flickering, the battery starting to give out. The tunnel we had run through now stretched behind us like a throat, dark and unrelenting, and we had nowhere else to go. Elias was gone. I'd seen it. I'd seen the way the statues, those things, dragged him toward the monolith like he was nothing more than a puppet, his scream ringing through the air as he vanished into the light. I didn't know what had happened to him. I didn't want to know. But the way the monolith pulsed after, like it was satisfied, left a sick feeling twisting in my gut. Leah's voice broke through the silence, so soft I almost didn't hear her. "We shouldn't have come here." I turned my head toward her. Her eyes were distant, staring at the floor like she wasn't really seeing it. "They wanted us here," she continued, her voice hollow, almost mechanical. "Whatever's down here, it called us. All of us. Elias didn't fall. He didn't trip. He walked toward it, Daniel. He walked. It was in his head." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. "It's not going to get us," I said, though my voice sounded weak, even to me. Leah laughed softly, a sound that had no humor in it. "You don't understand, do you? It doesn't need to get us. It's already here." Sarah lifted her head, her tear-streaked face pale in the dim light. "Stop it, Leah," she choked out, her voice raw. "We can still get out. We just need to find a way. There's got to be another way up." But Leah shook her head, still staring at the floor. "There is no way up. This place doesn't let people leave. You saw it, you felt it." Her words settled over us like a fog, thick and impossible to escape. She was right, of course. I had felt it. The pull, the hum in the air. The way the monolith seemed to crawl into my mind the closer I got to it. But I couldn't let myself believe we were trapped here. I couldn't. I picked up my flashlight and stood, the light shaking slightly in my grip. Then we find a way out anyway. We don't just sit here and wait for whatever's down here to take us. That's what it wants. Sarah wiped at her face with the sleeve of her jacket and pushed herself upright. Her hands were shaking, but there was a flicker of determination in her eyes. "He's right. Sitting here won't help. We move." Leah didn't argue. She just stood silently, her movements slow and mechanical, like she was moving on autopilot. I turned the flashlight toward the far end of the chamber, where the tunnel stretched into the unknown, and started walking. Every step echoed off the stone walls, the sound bouncing back at me like something following close behind. The whispering returned, not loud, not distinct, but there, threading through the silence, like faint cracks in glass. Sarah walked just behind me, her flashlight flickering as she swept it back and forth. Leah trailed behind, her steps soft and uneven, as though the effort of moving was too much. None of us spoke. The air was cold here, colder than before, and I could see my breath curling in thin clouds in front of me. The further we walked, the more it felt like the tunnel itself was pressing in on us, closing tighter, swallowing us, inch by inch. After what felt like hours, we reached an opening. I froze as I stepped into the cavern beyond, my flashlight beam sweeping over the space. It was massive, easily larger than the last, with towering columns of stone rising out of the ground like broken teeth. The carvings were everywhere now, glowing faintly, lighting the space with an eerie red glow that pulsed in time with the deep, rhythmic hum that filled the air. The sound was louder here, so much louder, vibrating through my chest, my teeth, the tips of my fingers. At the center of the cavern, there was a pit, a vast, yawning hole in the earth that stretched downward into darkness. The carvings led straight to it, veins of glowing light converging at its edges, as though feeding into it, or perhaps feeding from it. The hum seemed to come from the pit, deep and resonant, vibrating the very ground beneath our feet. "We're not going in there," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Leah stepped closer, her flashlight trembling in her hands as she peered into the darkness below. "It's awake," she murmured. "What's awake?" I demanded, my voice sharp, my patience finally breaking. She turned toward me, her face pale and drawn, her eyes too wide. "The thing that was buried here. The thing they worship." I didn't want to ask who they were. I didn't want to know. But as I scanned the cavern, I saw them, shapes scattered along the edges of the pit. Statues like before, dozens of them, hunched and twisted, their faces frozen in agony, their hollow eyes staring down into the abyss. Sarah let out a strangled sound and stumbled back. "We have to go. Now." I turned toward the tunnel, but the ground shifted beneath us. The carvings flared brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat, and the hum grew deafening. The statues moved. It started as a twitch, a flicker of motion, but then their limbs began to jerk and snap, pulling them upright. Their heads turned toward us in unison, those hollow sockets locking onto me like a predator locking onto prey. My breath caught in my throat. The whispering turned into a roar, and the pit screamed. The sound tore through the cavern, rattling my skull, driving me to my knees. I grabbed at my ears, but it didn't stop. It wasn't a sound you could block out. It was inside me, vibrating through my bones, pulling me toward the pit, toward the darkness. Leah dropped her flashlight and staggered forward, her face blank, her steps slow and deliberate, like she wasn't in control of her own body. "Leah!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. She didn't stop. She didn't turn. The statues were closing in now, their movements twitchy and jerky, surrounding us, cutting us off from the tunnel. I grabbed Leah's arm, yanking her back with every ounce of strength I had. Her body shuddered, and for a split second, her eyes met mine, clear, terrified. "Run!" she whispered. And then the ground gave way. The ground cracked and dropped beneath us like a trapdoor swinging open, pulling us into the dark. My stomach lurched, the weightless feeling twisting into pure panic as I tumbled through air and stone. The roar of collapsing rock was deafening, a wall of sound that swallowed my scream before it could escape my throat. I reached out blindly, my fingers scraping against the rough edges of stone. But there was nothing to grab, only empty space and the pull of gravity. When I hit the ground, the impact sent a shockwave through my body. Pain exploded through my side as my ribs collided with hard rock, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I lay there, stunned, my ears ringing, my mind struggling to make sense of anything. The world felt like it had caved in around me. Because it had. Danielle. Sarah's voice, distant but urgent, broke through the ringing in my ears. It pulled me back, like a rope dragging me from drowning waters. I coughed, my lungs aching, and pushed myself upright. My hands were shaking. My flashlight cracked and dim, but it still worked. The beam flickered weakly, cutting through the black. I wasn't alone. Sarah's light blinked into view across the chamber. She was on her knees, clutching her arm, blood streaking down the side of her face. Leah was next to her, slumped but conscious, blinking slowly like she was trying to remember where she was. Around us, chunks of stone littered the floor, dust hanging in the air like fog. "We're alive," I croaked, my voice hoarse, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The chamber was smaller than the others, the ceiling jagged where we'd fallen through. The walls pressed closer, covered with those same markings, deeper now, etched as though the stone had been burned. They glowed faintly, pulsating like veins beneath skin, their red light casting shadows that seemed to move even when we didn't. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the stone beneath us, rattling my teeth. But the worst part wasn't the light or the hum. It was the pit. The center of the chamber sank into a hole, a massive gash torn into the ground. The edges were uneven, crumbling, as though something had clawed its way up from below. The darkness within it was absolute, impenetrable, even by the beam of my flashlight. I couldn't see the bottom, but I could feel it. The emptiness. The cold weight of it pressing against my chest, drawing me toward it like gravity had shifted. Sarah staggered to her feet, swaying slightly as she pointed toward it. It's where it came from, isn't it?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We all knew. Leah groaned softly as she sat up, her eyes darting to the pit, widening with recognition. "It's awake," she whispered. "The thing we saw before. That was just a part of it. A piece. The rest is down there." Her words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold air. I turned to her, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can't think about that right now. We need to find a way out. That's all that matters." But as the words left my mouth, the whispering began again. It came from the pit, soft at first, like a breeze moving across dead leaves, then louder, sharper, voices overlapping, rising and falling in a rhythm that made my head ache. The words were still unintelligible, but the sound of them crawled through me like icy fingers, pressing against my mind, pulling me closer to the edge. Sarah's flashlight flickered as she staggered back, clutching her head. "Do you hear it? Do you hear it? Stay away from the edge," I shouted, reaching for her, but she stumbled, her flashlight clattering to the ground. I grabbed her arm, pulling her back as her shoes scraped against the loose gravel. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, her mouth moving silently, as though she were repeating the whispers to herself. Leah stood, swaying, her gaze locked on the pit. "It's calling to us," she said faintly. I whipped around to face her. "Don't listen to it. It's not real. Whatever this is, whatever's down there, it's trying to pull us in. We have to fight it." The words sounded weak, even to me. I could feel it too, the pull of that endless dark. My limbs felt heavy, my thoughts clouded, like the whispers were slipping under my skin and wrapping around my bones. And then the ground shook. The vibration started as a low rumble, building until the entire chamber trembled. Dust and small rocks rained from the ceiling, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through my skull. The light from the markings flared brighter, casting blood-red shadows that danced across the walls. From the pit came a sound, deep and resonant, like a groan from something ancient. It rose slowly, rumbling up through the stone, growing louder until it felt like the earth itself was screaming. I grabbed Leah's arm, yanking her back as cracks splintered across the ground, spiderwebbing outward from the pit's edge. "We need to move," I shouted, but my voice was lost in the roar. The pit shifted. Something moved within it, something massive and slow, its form hidden in the darkness, but its presence undeniable. The air turned frigid as the whispering merged into a single low chant, rhythmic and hollow, vibrating through the ground. The walls. Us. Leah screamed as her flashlight blinked out, leaving us with nothing but the red glow of the markings. I grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward Sarah as the ground beneath us cracked and buckled. The pit was spreading, growing wider with every second, and from its depths came the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, deep, and endless. The chamber began to collapse. Chunks of stone crashed down around us, shattering into clouds of dust. I ran, dragging Leah with me, Sarah close behind. The air was thick, heavy, filled with the pulse that matched every beat of my heart. Ahead, a tunnel, narrow, jagged, but real, opened up at the far end of the chamber. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to breathe. I just ran, the others at my heels as the pit yawned wider, its edges crumbling into the dark. The roar chased us, the sound of the earth splitting apart, and with it came a feeling, a certainty, that something enormous was rising behind us. We stumbled into the tunnel just as the ground gave way, the edges collapsing into the void. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The air was thick with dust and heat, the whispering still lingering in my ears, like it was inside me now. The tunnel stretched ahead, but the hum, the pulse, followed us. It was part of the earth, part of everything. And as I ran, my lungs burning, my heart pounding, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This place didn't want us to escape, and it wasn't going to let us. The tunnel stretched on forever, narrowing as we ran, its walls clawing at us like jagged fingers. The ground beneath my boots shook with every step, the hum rising to an unbearable pitch, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the thick dust clouding the air. I didn't dare look back. I knew what was behind us. I could feel it, looming, relentless, just beyond the light. Sarah's breathing was ragged behind me, each gasp sharp and desperate. Leah stumbled more than once, but I kept pulling her forward, her hand a vice around my wrist, slick with sweat. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were louder now, layered, broken voices crowding my head, their words still indistinct but heavy with meaning. They filled every inch of me, burrowing under my skin, sinking into my thoughts until I couldn't tell where my mind ended, and theirs began. The tunnel dipped downward, and the ground grew slick with something I refused to look at. My flashlight wavered across the walls, catching glimpses of carvings that pulsed with the same sick red glow. The symbols were shifting now, writhing, alive in a way that made my stomach turn. I forced myself not to stop, not to think, because stopping meant dying, or worse. Ahead of us, the tunnel opened into another chamber, its ceiling lost to darkness. I skidded to a halt just inside, dragging Leah and Sarah with me. The space was massive, the air thick and heavy, as if we'd stepped into the chest of something alive. At the far end of the chamber, it waited. A monolith. Not like the first, but something far worse rose from the center of the cavern. It wasn't stone anymore. It moved, its surface rippling like liquid, veins of red light pulsing just beneath its skin. The markings weren't carved. They were burned into it, glowing brighter with every pulse of the hum that now rattled through the air. The stone, me. And there, at the base of the monolith, the earth opened. A chasm stretched deep into the rock, so wide it seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. Shadows moved within it, shapes that slithered and twitched just out of sight. The sound rising from it was worse than the whispers now. A slow, deep breathing, as though the chasm itself was alive. Each inhale pulled the air from the room, leaving us gasping for breath. Each exhale rattled through my bones, heavy and ancient, as though it carried the weight of something older than time. Leah's voice broke, trembling, as she whispered, "It's waking up." I turned toward her, my flashlight catching the wild terror in her eyes. "What's waking up?" I asked, though I already knew. Her answer came barely above a whisper. "Everything." The hum reached its peak then, No longer just sound but pressure, pressing against my skull like hands trying to crack it open. Sarah dropped to her knees, clutching her head and screaming, her flashlight spinning wildly across the ground before flickering out. I stumbled back, grabbing Leah, trying to drag her away from the edge of the chasm, as the shadows moved faster now, spreading outward like oil through water. The monolith shifted, rising taller, its form rippling as though something massive was forcing its way through. The red glow flared so bright it burned behind my eyelids, but I couldn't look away. It was alive. It was pulling itself up from the chasm, something vast and shapeless, its form twisting and stretching as it clawed its way free. I couldn't see it fully, couldn't comprehend it, but I felt it. Its presence crashed over me like a tidal wave, freezing my blood, crushing the air from my lungs. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the ground, my flashlight clattering from my grip. The whispers turned into a single voice, low and resonant, vibrating through the cavern. The words still didn't make sense, but I understood them. They weren't asking. They weren't warning. They were claiming. This place wasn't a grave. It was a door, and we had opened it. Daniel. Leah's scream ripped through the noise, sharp and desperate. I turned to see her pulling Sarah to her feet, her flashlight swinging wildly as the shadows around us began to move. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Figures like the ones we'd seen before, statues that weren't statues, their limbs jerking as they pulled themselves free of the stone. Their hollow faces turned toward us in unison, their mouths stretching open in silent, endless screams. I grabbed Leah's arm and ran, pulling her toward the far side of the chamber. I didn't know where we were going. There was no way out, no light, no escape, but I couldn't stop. The ground shook beneath us, cracks spiderwebbing across the stone. The monolith roaring like the earth itself was being torn apart. The chasm widened, its edge crumbling as the thing beneath it rose higher, its shape bending and twisting, pulling at the very fabric of the air around us. Leah stumbled, and I turned just in time to catch her before she fell. "Get up," I shouted, my voice ragged. "We can't stop." Sarah was ahead of us now, running toward a faint glow at the far end of the chamber, a fissure in the wall, barely wide enough for a person to slip through. It wasn't an exit, but it was something. I forced my legs to move faster, dragging Leah with me, the sound of stone splitting and shadows crawling closer with every step. Behind us, the monolith shattered. The sound was a shriek, metal on metal, glass on glass, so loud it felt like my eardrums would burst. A shockwave blasted through the chamber, and I was thrown forward, my body colliding hard with the ground. Pain lanced through my shoulder, but I forced myself up, grabbing Leah and shoving her toward the fissure. "Go!" I screamed. She hesitated for only a moment before disappearing through the crack, followed by Sarah. I turned back just once, my flashlight beam catching the chaos behind me. The cavern collapsing, the chasm spreading, the shadows pouring upward as the thing rose, its form unfathomable, its presence heavy enough to crush the world. I didn't look again. I turned and ran, throwing myself into the fissure, dragging my body through jagged stone that tore at my clothes and skin. The roar of the collapsing chamber followed me, dust and debris choking the air as I pushed forward, my lungs screaming for breath. Then, suddenly, there was light. I burst out onto solid ground, collapsing in a heap as cold air hit my face like a slap. The world outside was pale and gray, the sky overcast, the desert stretching out endlessly before me. Leah and Sarah were there too, sprawled a few feet away, gasping for breath. I sat up slowly, my body shaking, and turned to look behind us. The fissure in the earth was closing, the ground swallowing itself like a wound knit and shut. The hum was fading now, distant, but still there, like a whisper on the wind. I could still feel it. The thing we'd seen, the thing we'd woken, waiting just below the surface. Sarah stared at me, her face streaked with blood and dust. "Is it over?" I didn't answer. I wasn't sure it would ever be over. I looked out across the empty desert, the wind tugging at my torn clothes, the silence pressing down like a weight. In the distance, I thought I heard it, the faintest echo of that hum, drifting through the air like a memory. We had escaped, but I knew, deep in my bones, that it wasn't done with us. It was awake now, and it was waiting.
The forest was a quiet graveyard of trees, their blackened limbs clawing at the pale, overcast sky. The air felt wrong, thicker, somehow, like it was pressing in on us with every step we took. Our boots crunched over dead leaves and brittle twigs as we moved deeper into hollow woods, the sounds too loud in the heavy silence. I'd walked in a lot of forest before, but none had ever felt like this. Suffocating, alive, like the trees themselves were listening. Josh led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the haze of mist that hung between the branches. He was the reason we were out here. He'd heard a story, one of those late-night, small-town legends you'd find buried in Reddit forums, that something was buried deep in this forest. A ruin. A crypt. Whatever it was, the locals didn't talk about it, and that alone had lit a fire in him. The four of us, me, Josh, Mia, and Emily, had followed, like idiots, chasing the thrill of a mystery. Now, I wasn't so sure. My flashlight caught movement to the left, and my breath hitched in my chest. I swung the beam around, my hand shaking slightly, but there was nothing, just more trees, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the forest floor. I let out a slow exhale, telling myself it was just my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "It's just up ahead," Josh called back to us, his voice low, eager. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure anyone else could either. Mia's face was pale in the weak light, her eyes darting to every shadow. Emily walked close to her, hands tucked deep into her jacket pockets, her shoulders hunched like she was trying to fold into herself. I couldn't blame her. The temperature had dropped as we moved further in, the air damp and sharp, heavy with the smell of moss, and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. After what felt like hours, we reached a clearing. The forest seemed to part around it, the mist pooling low to the ground like smoke. In the center stood a hill, small, almost perfect in its symmetry, covered with grass that had gone dry and gray. Josh didn't hesitate. He scrambled up the slope, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he moved. The rest of us followed, slower, our legs heavy, as though the ground itself was trying to hold us back. When I reached the top, I saw it. The crypt. It was embedded into the far side of the hill, a yawning black doorway framed by stones that were cracked and weathered with age. The carvings along the arch were almost gone, worn smooth in places, but the ones that remained were sharp, unnatural. They twisted and looped, forming shapes that made my head ache if I stared too long. I tore my gaze away, my chest tightening. The doorway seemed to breathe, the darkness within it alive, deeper than it should have been, like the earth itself had opened its mouth and was waiting for us to step inside. "Guys, this is it." Josh's voice broke the silence, too loud, too eager. "This is what I was talking about." I glanced back at the forest. The mist had thickened, swallowing the trees at the edge of the clearing. It felt like we'd stepped into another world, one where the rules were different, where the forest no longer ended but bled into something else entirely. My skin prickled. Josh didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his flashlight cutting into the blackness of the crypt. The beam seemed to vanish, swallowed whole, but he didn't stop. He crouched near the entrance, running his hand over one of the stones. "These carvings, look at this. They're not natural. They're—" "Don't touch them," I said sharply. the words escaping before I could stop them. Josh glanced up, grinning, like I was overreacting. "It's fine, man. They're just rocks." But I wasn't so sure. My flashlight flickered slightly, the beam dimming, and for a split second I thought I saw something move at the edge of the doorway. Something small and quick, disappearing into the dark. My heart hammered in my chest. I opened my mouth to say something, but then Josh's hand brushed one of the carvings. The ground shifted. It wasn't much, a low tremor, almost a vibration, but I felt it deep in my bones, like the earth itself was waking up. My flashlight flickered again, and this time it wasn't just mine. Mia gasped, her beam sputtering before going out completely. "Did you feel that?" Emily whispered. Josh stepped back, his grin fading as he turned to face us. I think something's down there." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was staring past him, at the doorway. The darkness within it had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It wasn't nothing. It was moving. A faint sound drifted up from the crypt, so soft at first I thought I was imagining it. A whisper, a wordless murmur, like wind rushing through a tunnel, but there was no wind. It grew louder, crawling through the air, rising and falling in a rhythm that made my head throb. I stepped back instinctively, my flashlight shaking as I tried to focus on the source. "Josh," I said, my voice hoarse, "we need to go, now." He didn't move. He was staring at the doorway, his eyes wide, his face pale. His flashlight fell from his hand, clattering against the stone. The whispering grew louder, threading through my thoughts like needles, pulling at something deep inside me. "Josh!" I shouted this time, grabbing his arm. That broke the spell. He blinked, stumbling back, his face slack with confusion. I heard it," he muttered, his voice hollow. "I heard something." I didn't want to know what he'd heard. I didn't want to know what any of us were hearing now. The whispering was everywhere, on the wind, in the ground, in my head. The carvings on the stones seemed brighter now, their edges glowing faintly as though something beneath them was waking up. Mia grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. "Daniel, we need to get out of here." I nodded. "Go. Now." We turned back toward the forest, but the mist was thicker, swirling like it was alive, twisting into shapes that shifted and broke apart before I could focus on them. I grabbed Josh's arm, pulling him with me as we stumbled back down the slope. My chest ached with every breath, the air sharp and cold. The whispering didn't stop. It followed us, threading through the trees, growing louder as though it had taken notice of us, of what we'd done. I looked back once, just for a second. The doorway to the crypt was still there, its edges glowing faintly, the darkness within it pulsing, breathing, like it was waiting. And in that moment, I knew. We hadn't found the crypt. The crypt had found us. The mist clung to us like damp, icy hands as we pushed through the forest. My breath came sharp and ragged, every inhale tasting like copper. The whispering had followed us. It was quieter now, distant, but still there. It moved through the trees, threading between the branches, drifting in and out of hearing like it was teasing us. None of us spoke as we ran, stumbling over roots and cracked earth, too afraid to look back. Josh tripped first. His foot caught on a thick root, and he went down hard, landing with a thud that echoed louder than it should have. I stopped immediately, turning back to grab him, but he was already sitting up, his face pale and streaked with dirt. His eyes darted wildly around the forest, the flashlight shaking in his trembling hand. "Get up," I hissed, glancing nervously behind us. "We need to keep moving." He didn't say anything. He just stared at me for a moment, like he wasn't sure who I was, before scrambling to his feet. Emily and Mia were waiting a few feet ahead, their flashlights flickering as the mist thickened, curling around their ankles like smoke. I could see it in their faces, the same fear that churned in my gut. It was following us. We didn't stop again until we stumbled out of the trees, back onto the gravel road that led to town. The forest's edge loomed behind us, the mist swirling just beyond the tree line, like it was watching. For a moment, none of us spoke. We just stood there, gasping for air, our flashlights the only light in the heavy gloom. Josh broke the silence. His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. "You heard it too, didn't you?" Mia shot him a sharp look, but her voice trembled when she spoke. Don't talk about it. We can't pretend it didn't happen," he snapped, louder this time. The whispering, that thing, whatever it was alive. "It wasn't alive," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "It was, I don't know, just some weird acoustics in the crypt, old stone, sound carries." But Josh wasn't listening. He was pacing now, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically across the ground. "It said something, I heard it. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt them, like it was inside my head." Emily shivered, hugging herself. "Stop it, Josh. Please." He turned to her, his expression wild. "You know I'm right. You heard it too. It's like it saw us." "Enough," I barked, my voice sharper than I intended. Josh froze, and for a second, everything was silent except for the wind sighing softly through the trees. I swallowed hard, forcing my hands to stop shaking. "We're all freaked out, okay? Let's just get back to town. We'll talk about it tomorrow, when it's light. Nobody argued. We turned toward the distant glow of Black Hollow's few streetlights, walking in silence. The road felt longer than I remembered, the darkness heavier. I kept glancing back at the forest, half expecting to see something moving between the trees, a shadow, a flicker of light, a shape that didn't belong. But there was nothing. Only the mist, curling along the ground like lazy tendrils. When we finally reached town, everything was still. Black Hollow was small, just a handful of houses, a general store, a diner that only opened 3 days a week, but tonight it felt abandoned. Most of the windows were dark, curtains drawn tight, as though the town itself had turned its back on us. Josh split off first, muttering something about needing to be alone. His house sat at the edge of town, barely more than a shadow in the weak light. I wanted to stop him, to tell him not to go, but I couldn't find the words. He didn't look back. The three of us, me, Mia, and Emily, walked the rest of the way in silence. Mia's house was next. She paused at the front door, one hand on the doorknob, her face pale. "We're not going back there, are we?" "No," I said, though I wasn't sure I meant it. "Not after tonight." She nodded once, then slipped inside, the door clicking shut behind her. Emily lived just down the block, so I walked her the rest of the way. She didn't say anything, and I didn't push her. When she disappeared inside her house, I was alone. The air felt colder suddenly, the wind sharper. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and started toward home, my flashlight still clutched in my hand even though the streetlights were on. The town was too quiet. There were no crickets, no distant hum of passing cars, nothing. Just silence, deep and absolute, broken only by the faint sound of my footsteps. I was halfway down my street when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to catch, but it was there, carried on the wind, threading through the stillness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and swung my flashlight around, the beam bouncing over empty yards and cracked pavement. Nothing. No one. But the whispering grew louder, clearer, like it was moving closer. I forced myself to keep walking, my pulse hammering in my ears. My house was just up ahead, its porch light casting a pale circle onto the driveway. I jogged the last few steps, fumbling with my keys as the whispering seemed to coil around me, brushing against my ears, my neck, too close. I shoved the key into the lock, flung the door open, and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind me. Silence. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, the flashlight beam shaking wildly in my grip. Slowly, the panic ebbed, replaced by the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination playing tricks on me. The crypt had messed with all of us, that was all. But as I turned off the flashlight and walked toward the stairs, I heard it again. A whisper. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the living room. I froze, my blood running cold, and turned my head slowly. The room was dark, the faint light from the window barely enough to see by. But there, in the reflection of the glass, I saw it, a shape, standing perfectly still in the center of the room. It was tall, its form too thin, its arms hanging low at its sides. I blinked, and it was gone. The room was empty again, the whispering fading like smoke, leaving only silence. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Somewhere, far off in the distance, the wind sighed through the trees. And I knew it had followed us home. The next morning, Black Hollow felt even quieter than usual. The gray sky pressed low over the town, a blanket of clouds so thick it looked like it might swallow the rooftops. The wind barely stirred, and the streets, already too empty most days, felt wrong, like the town was holding its breath. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the reflection in the glass, the shape standing there, silent and still, its arms hanging too long, its head tilted like it was looking at me. I kept telling myself I imagined it. It wasn't real. But I couldn't forget the whispering. It was in my ears, my head, still there, even in the dead silence of my room. I turned on every light in the house last night, and still didn't feel safe. When I finally stepped outside, the cold air felt sharp, too real, like a slap to the face. My breath fogged in front of me as I walked, my hands shoved deep into my jacket pockets. The others had to feel it too, whatever this was. I found them at the diner. The smell of old coffee and grease clung to the air as I pushed open the door, the bell above it jangling faintly. Mia and Emily sat in a booth near the window, staring at cups of untouched coffee. Josh was slumped over next to them, his face pale and shadowed like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "You look like hell," I muttered, sliding into the seat across from him. He didn't even smile. "Yeah, well, I feel worse." Mia didn't say anything, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. She looked up at me slowly, her eyes sunken, her expression distant. "Did you hear it?" she asked softly, like she already knew the answer. I hesitated, my throat tight. "Yeah, I heard it." Josh let out a bitter laugh, the sound dry and humorless. "It didn't stop. It's still in my head. He broke off, his hand twitching as he rubbed at his temple. "I thought I saw something in my room last night. I woke up, and it was just there, in the corner, watching me." A cold shiver prickled the back of my neck. I glanced at Emily. She wasn't looking at any of us. Her gaze was fixed on the window, her face pale. "What about you?" I asked. She didn't answer for a moment. Then, in a whisper so soft I almost missed it, she said, "I saw it outside. By the trees. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there." I turned to look out the window. The street outside was empty, the fog pooling low across the ground. But even in the daylight, the forest felt closer, like it was leaning toward the edge of town. "We shouldn't have gone in there," Mia said suddenly, her voice sharp and tight. "We woke something up. I know it. That crypt. It wasn't meant to be found." Josh slammed his hand against the table, the sound echoing through the quiet diner. "Then what are we supposed to do, huh? Just sit here and wait for it to do whatever it's going to do. It's not just going to stop." The waitress shot us a look from behind the counter, and I realized how loud we'd gotten. I lowered my voice, leaning in closer. "We're not waiting for anything. We're going back." 3 pairs of eyes snapped toward me. "What?" Mia hissed. "You want to go back there?" Emily's voice cracked. "Are you insane?" I swallowed hard, forcing my hands to stop shaking. "You all feel it. I do too. Whatever this is, it's not going to stop. Not unless we figure out what we woke up. That crypt. There's something there. Something it wants. And if we don't figure out what's happening, it's just going to get worse. Nobody said anything. The hum of the old diner lights buzzed faintly overhead, the sound filling the silence like static. Josh broke it first. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low. "But if we're going back, we go prepared this time. I don't care if it's a ghost, a monster, or just some messed up old ruin. I'm not going back there blind." Mia and Emily didn't argue. Maybe they knew I was right, even if they didn't want to admit it. The forest was worse in the daylight. I thought the sun would make it feel smaller, less alive, but the mist was still there, thicker now, pooling like smoke around our ankles. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches blocking out the sky, plunging us into an unnatural twilight. It was colder here too, so cold I could see my breath, even though it wasn't winter. Josh led the way this time, a crowbar clutched in his hand like it would make a difference. Mia and Emily followed close behind, their flashlights sweeping the ground. My own flashlight felt too small in my hand, its beam swallowed almost immediately by the mist. The hill appeared suddenly, rising out of the ground like a scar. It looked worse than before. The grass was blackened, dead, the earth cracked and dry. The crypt waited at the far side, its stone doorway gaping like an open mouth. For a long moment, none of us moved. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, fast and uneven, the same rhythm I'd heard in the whispering. It was louder now, like the ground itself was humming. "Let's make this fast," Josh said, his voice tight. We approached the crypt together, our flashlights cutting weak beams through the dark. The doorway hadn't changed. It was still too black, too deep, like it didn't lead anywhere real. The carvings on the stone seemed brighter now, their edges sharp and angry, pulsing faintly as though something beneath them was alive. Josh stepped in first, crouching to examine the carvings. "They're not just symbols," he muttered. "They're words, or something like words." "How do you know that?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. He didn't look up. "Because I can hear them." Mia's flashlight flickered. "What?" Josh pointed at one of the stones. "Listen." At first, there was nothing, just silence and the distant rustle of leaves. But then I heard it, the whispering. It wasn't coming from the forest anymore. It was coming from the crypt, soft and low, like something just out of hearing. I stepped closer, my skin prickling with cold, and as I did, the whispers grew louder. Emily gasped. "It's getting louder." The ground trembled. The sound deepened, vibrating through my bones, like a voice too big for the space it filled. The carvings glowed brighter, their red light spilling across the ground. Josh stepped back, his face pale, his hand tightening around the crowbar. And then the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed against us, heavy and absolute, like the forest itself was waiting. I turned toward the doorway just as something moved in the dark, something tall, thin, and waiting. My flashlight flickered and I saw it. A hand, long and pale, reached out of the crypt, its fingers dragging across the stone, leaving streaks of black where it touched. Josh staggered back. "Run!" The word shattered the silence, and we ran. The forest blurred around us as we ran, our footsteps pounding against the earth, every breath sharp and ragged in the freezing air. I didn't look back, couldn't. The whispers had turned into something worse, a low growl that vibrated through the ground, pulling at my legs like unseen hands. My flashlight swung wildly in my grip, its beam barely cutting through the mist. Josh was ahead of me, the crowbar still clutched tightly in his hand, and I could hear Mia and Emily just behind, their breaths as broken as mine. The ground beneath my feet trembled. Not much, just enough to let me know that something was moving below us. "Faster!" Josh shouted, his voice ragged. The sound from the crypt followed us. It wasn't footsteps. It was dragging, like something massive was pulling itself along, scraping across the stone and earth. And underneath that was the whispering, no longer faint or distant. It was louder, closer, swirling around us like a storm, layering into something rhythmic, like a chant. I don't remember how far we ran. Time seemed to bend in the mist. The trees all looked the same, their blackened limbs clawing at the air. But eventually, the forest thinned, and the faint glow of Black Hollow's streetlights flickered through the haze like a dying beacon. My legs burned, but I didn't stop until I hit the gravel road, stumbling to a halt. Josh dropped to his knees, his chest heaving, the crowbar slipping from his fingers. Mia collapsed next to him, clutching her sides, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Emily stood further back, shaking so hard her flashlight jittered wildly in her hands. For a long moment, none of us spoke. We couldn't. The silence was too thick, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the wind sighing through the trees. And then, in the distance, the whispering stopped. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The absence of sound felt worse, like the forest was waiting, holding its breath. I turned to look back at the tree line, my heart still racing, expecting to see something, anything, emerge from the dark. But the mist hung still, swirling lazily along the ground, as if nothing had happened at all. Josh's voice broke through the silence, hoarse and unsteady. What the hell was that?" Nobody answered. Mia wiped at her face with trembling hands, leaving smudges of dirt streaked across her skin. "It was real," she whispered. "It was real. That wasn't—" She broke off, her voice cracking. Emily sank to the ground, curling in on herself. "I saw it," she muttered, rocking slightly. "It touched the stone, and it—" She choked on the words, her voice breaking into a low sob. "It's not done with us." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. My chest felt like it was being squeezed. The image of the hand reaching out of the crypt burned into my brain, pale and wrong, with fingers that left streaks of blackness wherever they touched. "It came from the crypt," I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. "It's awake now. Whatever was buried down there, whatever we woke up, it's not staying put." Josh's head snapped up, his expression a mixture of fear and anger. "So what do we do, huh? Just wait here for it to come find us, because you know it's not stopping. It followed us. I could feel it." "We need answers," I said quietly. "That book at the old church, it talked about something buried here, something ancient. If anyone knew what's happening, it was the people who lived here before us. Maybe we can find a way to stop it." "The church." Mia shook her head, her voice unsteady. "You think a building is going to protect us from that?" "It's better than sitting here," I shot back. "If we don't figure out what this thing is, it's going to keep coming, and it's not going to stop with us." For a long moment, no one said anything. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against the trees and kicking gravel across the road. Finally, Josh stood, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. "Fine," he muttered. "But we move fast. I'm not staying in that place longer than we have to." The old church sat at the edge of town, its silhouette a black smudge against the slate-gray sky. The bell tower had collapsed years ago, leaving the steeple jagged and broken like a shattered tooth. Ivy crawled up the sides of the building, its leaves brittle and dead, and the windows were dark, their stained glass long since broken. We pushed open the heavy doors together, the wood groaning loudly in the stillness. The smell inside was overpowering, mildew and rot, thick and cloying. Dust drifted through the air in heavy motes, catching faint beams of light that leaked through cracks in the walls. Rows of pews sat empty and crumbling, their wood split and warped with age. At the front of the church, the altar still stood, though the wood was blackened, as though it had been burned. Carvings covered the surface, symbols like the ones we'd seen on the crypt. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam illuminating the jagged lines etched into the wood. The air was colder here, pressing against my skin like ice. Josh crouched next to the altar, brushing dust away from the carvings. These symbols, they're the same. What do they mean? Mia stepped closer, her flashlight flickering slightly. They're warnings. Look, these ones here. They're the same shapes that were on the stones in the crypt. I looked at the carvings, trying to make sense of them. They twisted and looped, their patterns unnatural, like they had been scratched into the wood by something not human. But then, as my flashlight passed over the edge of the altar, I saw something else. A book, its leather cover cracked and blackened, sat wedged beneath the altar's base. I grabbed it, pulling it free. Dust fell from its pages as I opened it. The parchment yellowed and brittle beneath my fingers. The writing was almost illegible, faded ink, strange symbols, but here and there, words stood out, written in a language I half recognized. Emily peered over my shoulder, her voice tight. What does it say? I traced one passage with my finger, my throat tightening as I read aloud. The door must remain sealed. It holds what should not wake, what must not see the world above. Blood binds it. Blood keeps it still. The words hit like a fist to the chest. Blood died. That word sat heavy in the air, lingering between us. Josh swore under his breath, shoving himself upright. So what? It's awake because we touched it, because we were there. Mia's voice cracked. And what does that mean for us? I didn't have an answer. The whispers, faint but insistent, began again, threading through the church like a draft. I froze, every muscle locking tight. It was here, in the air, in the walls, calling to us. The door to the church slammed shut. Emily screamed. The door slammed shut with a thunderous finality that made my heart lurch. The sound echoed through the church, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I swung the flashlight toward the entrance, its weak beam sweeping over the warped wooden doors. They didn't move. They didn't so much as creak. For a moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the whispering, faint but unmistakable, curling through the stale air like smoke. Emily pressed her back against the nearest pew, her flashlight shaking so badly the beam bounced wildly across the floor. "It's here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's in here with us." The whispers grew louder. I turned back toward the altar, gripping the book so tightly the leather creaked under my fingers. The words I'd read were still crawling through my mind. Blood binds it. Blood keeps it still. The meaning of it settled like a stone in my gut, cold and sharp. Whatever had been sealed in that crypt hadn't just been buried. It had been bound, locked away with something ancient and cruel, and we'd let it out. Josh took a shaky step toward the door, the crowbar clutched like a lifeline. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice low but urgent. He grabbed the handle, pulling hard, but the door didn't budge. He yanked again, his breath coming faster, panic rising in his voice. "Come on. Come on." "It won't open," Mia said softly. She wasn't even looking at the door. Her eyes were fixed on the far corner of the church, where the shadows seemed to grow darker, denser, as though the light from our flashlights couldn't touch them. I followed her gaze, my stomach twisting. The shadows were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they shifted and stretched, spreading like ink spilling into water. My flashlight beam trembled as I swept it across the far wall, but the darkness swallowed it whole. And then I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, its form bending unnaturally, unfolded itself from the shadows. Its limbs dragged against the ground, too long, its movements jerky and stilted like a puppet on broken strings. I couldn't see its face. There was nothing there but a hollow void where features should have been. But it was looking at us. I could feel it. "Back away," I croaked, my voice hoarse. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The thing took a step forward, its arms twitching, its body unfolding inch by inch as it dragged itself into the faint light. The air grew colder with every step it took, the temperature plummeting until I could see my breath curling in front of me like smoke. The whispering grew louder, sharper, threading through my thoughts, pulling at the edges of my mind like fingers scraping against glass. Josh stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the ground. "What is that?" The thing lurched forward. Its sudden movement snapped us out of the trance. Josh grabbed Mia's arm, yanking her toward the pews, and Emily screamed, the sound echoing through the empty church like a jagged knife. I turned and ran, shoving my flashlight into the book as I clutched it tight, my boots sliding on the dusty floor. "Get to the side door," I shouted, my voice raw. "Move." Mia bolted first, her flashlight beam cutting through the dark as she sprinted toward the door at the far side of the church. Josh followed close behind, dragging Emily with him, her sobs barely audible over the sound of my own pounding heartbeat. The thing moved faster now, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it closed the distance, the shadows stretching behind it like black tendrils. I reached the door a second after Mia and grabbed the handle, praying it would open. It didn't. The wood shuddered under my grip, but it held fast, sealed as tight as the front entrance. I felt something shift behind me, a low vibration that crawled through the air like a growl. "Josh, the crowbar," I shouted. Josh shoved Emily behind him and jammed the crowbar against the edge of the door, his face red with effort as he pushed. Come on, come on." The whispering turned into a roar. I looked back. The thing was close now, its form towering over the pews, its limbs dragging deep gouges into the wood as it passed. The void where its face should have been seemed deeper now, wider, pulling at the light, pulling at us. It wasn't just a shadow, it was hungry, and we were the ones it wanted. "Josh!" I yelled again, panic rising in my throat. With a splintering crack, the door gave way. Josh stumbled forward, catching himself against the frame, and shoved it open. Cold air poured in, sharp and fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. "Go!" I shouted, shoving Mia and Emily through first. Josh scrambled after them, and I followed, the roar behind us shaking the very walls of the church. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't want to see how close it was. We spilled out into the open air, hitting the frozen ground hard. My palms scraped against gravel as I pushed myself up, gasping for breath. Behind us, the church groaned, a low, rattling sound, as though the building itself were alive. The door slammed shut on its own, the boom echoing through the trees, and then there was silence. We didn't move. For a long moment, we just lay there, the cold seeping into our bones, our breaths fogging in the dim light of dawn. I stared at the church, my chest heaving, the whispering still faint in my ears like the echo of a nightmare. Emily's voice broke the silence, small and trembling. "Did you see it? Did you see it?" Josh sat up slowly, rubbing a shaking hand over his face. "It wasn't human. That thing, it saw us." Mia stared at the church door, her face pale and hollow. "It doesn't want us to leave," she said softly. "It let us go because it wants us to come back." I pulled the book from under my arm, the leather cover now streaked with dirt and blood. The words inside felt heavier now, like they carried a weight I couldn't understand. "It's not going to stop," I said finally. My voice sounded empty, distant, like it wasn't mine at all. "It's awake now, and it's coming for all of us." Nobody argued. The truth hung there between us, cold and heavy, like the mist curling through the trees. We'd let something out, something that had been buried for a reason, and I didn't think we'd be able to put it back. The cold crept into my bones as we sat there in the dirt, staring at the church as though it might rise up and swallow us whole. My breathing slowed, but my heart refused to calm, its pounding loud and erratic in my ears. I kept expecting the door to slam open again, for that thing, that impossible, twisted shadow, to lurch after us. But the building stayed still, its windows dark, its walls silent, as though it hadn't just tried to kill us. Josh wiped his face with a shaking hand, his breath still uneven. "We're screwed. That thing isn't going to stop. It's going to follow us. You heard it. You felt it." His words hit like a weight. He wasn't wrong. The whispers hadn't left. Even out here, in the open air, I could feel it, not loud, not obvious, but there, crawling just below the surface like a splinter buried too deep to remove. Emily sat against a tree, her knees pulled up to her chest. She rocked back and forth, whispering something too low for me to catch. I didn't ask what it was. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Mia sat closest to me, her eyes locked on the book that lay in the dirt between us. Its cracked leather cover seemed darker now, streaked with grime and age, the symbols on it no longer inert but almost alive, twisting faintly when I looked at them too long. She pointed at it with one trembling finger. "That book! What else does it say?" I didn't want to open it again. I could still feel the weight of the words I'd read inside that church, the ones that hung heavy in the air like a curse. Blood binds it. Blood keeps it still. But we didn't have a choice. I picked it up, my fingers brushing over the surface. The leather was cold, colder than it should have been, like it had been sitting in the snow. I swallowed hard, flipping it open. The pages crumbled slightly under my touch, the faded ink twisting in ways that made my head ache. There, near the back, a section stood out. Symbols I couldn't understand surrounded a series of scrawled words written in a frantic hand that cut deep into the parchment. I read aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. "The seal cannot hold once broken. The door must be closed, lest it consume all. Those who wake it must feed it, bind it again with blood, their own or another's." Josh's face went pale. "What the hell does that mean? Feed it?" I shook my head, bile rising in my throat. "It means we broke the seal, and now we have to close it." Emily looked up, her face streaked with tears. "How? How do we close it?" I stared down at the words, my mind spinning. I didn't know. The book didn't explain the how, only the price. Blood, a binding, a sacrifice. I couldn't make sense of it beyond that, but deep down, I knew it didn't matter. The thing in the crypt, the thing we'd woken, it didn't want us to understand. It wanted us afraid, desperate, and broken. Josh stood, pacing. "So, what? We go back there and, what? Offer ourselves up? You saw that thing. We wouldn't last 2 seconds before it tore us apart." "We don't have a choice," Mia said softly. She looked at me, her eyes hollow. "Do we?" I shook my head. "No. If we don't stop it, it won't just be us. It'll be the whole town, maybe more." Josh laughed bitterly. "And you think we can stop it? You think we can just walk in there and make it go back to sleep? It's too late. We've already lost." "No," I said firmly, forcing the words through my teeth. "Not yet. We let it out, so we're the ones who have to put it back. I don't care if we're scared. I don't care if it's impossible. We don't get to just sit here and wait to die." The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Josh stopped pacing. His shoulders slumped, his face exhausted, but he nodded. "Fine. What's the plan?" We walked back to the forest with a kind of dread that made my skin crawl. The mist had thickened again, wrapping around the trees like a living thing, shifting in ways that made me doubt my eyes. My flashlight barely made a dent in the dark. Its beam swallowed as quickly as it was cast. The hill appeared sooner than I expected, rising out of the ground like a wound. The crypt waited, its doorway blacker than before, impossibly dark, as though the earth itself had opened up and hollowed out its core. The hum was back too, vibrating faintly in the ground beneath my boots. It was stronger now, louder, and I could feel it rising, pulling at us. We stopped at the base of the hill, none of us wanting to move closer. The book felt heavy in my hands, its words clawing at my mind, like the whispers from the dark. Are we really doing this? Josh's voice wavered, the anger gone now, replaced by fear. We have to, I said, though my mouth felt dry as dust. One by one, we climbed the slope. The crypt swallowed us whole, its darkness wrapping around us like a second skin. My flashlight flickered as we stepped inside, its beam barely enough to show the ground in front of me. The air was colder here, sharp and wet, carrying the faint smell of rot. We reached the center, the broken altar, the same place where it all started. The carvings on the walls and floor glowed faintly now, pulsing red like veins beneath flesh. The hum was deafening here, rattling through my skull, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. And then it came. The thing. It rose out of the dark, its form shifting and bending, too tall, too thin, its limbs dragging as it moved toward us. The shadows crawled after it, spreading across the floor like oil, reaching for us, pulling at the light. Its face, or where its face should have been, was a void, deep and endless, like it could swallow the world whole. The whispering came in a rush, filling the air, deafening, pulling at my mind. I dropped to my knees, the book slipping from my grip, the words unraveling in my head like broken glass. Blood binds it. It echoed through me, through the crypt, rising in the whispers, in the hum, in the way the walls seemed to pulse like a beating heart. I looked at Mia, at Josh, at Emily. They were on the ground too, the thing towering over us, its arms spreading wide as the shadows closed in. Blood binds it. And then I understood. The price, the seal, the sacrifice. I grabbed the book, my vision swimming, and forced myself to my feet. My voice broke as I shouted over the roar of the whispers. We have to bind it, with our blood. Josh stared at me, his face pale, uncomprehending. What are you talking about? There's no other way. I screamed. We broke it. We're the ones who have to close it. I didn't wait for them. I tore the edge of my palm against the jagged stone on the altar, the pain sharp and hot as blood pooled into my hand. I slammed it against the carvings, the red glow flaring so bright it burned my eyes. The hum grew louder, rattling the air, the crypt, the world itself. The thing shrieked, a sound that tore through everything, its form jerking violently, its shadows clawing at me, at all of us. Mia cried out as she did the same, her blood smeared across the stone, followed by Josh, his face twisted in horror. Emily was last, her voice breaking as she pressed her hand against the altar. The glow burst outward, blinding, and the crypt shook. The air exploded in a roar, and I felt the thing, its presence, its weight, pulling back, dragged into the dark like a fire being snuffed out. And then there was nothing. Silence. The silence that followed was unnatural. It wasn't peace or quiet. It was absence, like the air itself had been drained from the crypt. My ears rang in the void, the faint metallic taste of blood lingering on my tongue as I staggered back from the altar. My flashlight flickered on the stone floor, its beam weak and trembling, as though it was too afraid to illuminate what had just happened. Mia slumped to the ground beside me, clutching her palm, blood still dripping in slow, steady beats. Josh was on his knees, breathing hard, his hand pressed against the wall, as though it was the only thing keeping him upright. Emily hadn't moved yet. She knelt by the altar, her head bowed, her shoulders trembling like she was praying, or maybe like she was breaking. For a moment, all I could do was stand there, my mind refusing to catch up to the reality of what we'd done. My own blood was smeared across the stone, mixed with theirs, staining the jagged carvings that still glowed faintly beneath the red smear. The whispers had stopped. The hum had vanished. The air was still. It was over. Or at least, it should have been. But then I felt it. Oh, deep in my chest, like an invisible thread tied tight around my ribcage. I gasped, stumbling back, clutching at my shirt as if I could claw it away. It wasn't just me. I could see it in the others, too. Josh's face twisted in pain as he dropped to his knees, his hands pressed against his chest. Mia let out a choked cry, curling forward as though someone had punched the air out of her. "No," I rasped, my voice little more than a breath. "No, we did it. We did it." The carvings on the altar flared suddenly, a sickly, red light that poured across the crypt like spilled ink. The stone trembled beneath my feet, dust raining down from the low ceiling, the vibrations rattling in my teeth. I could hear the hum again, not faint this time, but rising, steady, rhythmic, like a pulse. It wasn't angry. It wasn't chaotic. It was triumphant. And that's when I realized. We hadn't sealed it. We'd fed it. A sound began in the dark. It started low, almost imperceptible, a deep, rattling breath, pulling air through unseen lungs. It wasn't coming from behind us or ahead of us. It was coming from everywhere. The walls seemed to vibrate with it, the pulse rising as though the crypt itself was alive, breathing with the thing that had never truly left. Emily screamed first, a sharp, raw sound that cut through me like a knife. She clutched her head, stumbling backward, her flashlight spinning across the stone floor. "It's in my head. It's in my—" Her words cut off as the walls shifted. The shadows returned, crawling out from cracks and crevices, pouring like liquid across the ground. They coiled around us, twisting and stretching, flickering at the edges as though the light itself was breaking apart. Shapes formed within them, arms, legs, faces that weren't faces, things that stared at us with empty hollows where eyes should have been. "No," Josh gasped, dragging himself to his feet, his face white as chalk. "We closed it. We did everything it said." "It lied," I choked out, backing away as the shadows inched closer. My flashlight flickered in my hand, useless now. "We gave it what it wanted. It's stronger. It's—" The altar exploded. Stone shattered outward, fragments slicing through the air as a rush of wind hit us like a wall. I was thrown backward, my head slamming against the ground as the light above me died. I couldn't see anything anymore, only dark, endless dark, and the sound of the hum, louder now, vibrating through my bones, rising into something like a scream. I tried to stand, but something was holding me down, pressing into my chest like a weight. The shadows were all around me, moving, reaching, crawling inside me. I could feel them wrapping around my limbs, pulling at my skin, my thoughts, as though trying to consume me piece by piece. And then, for just a second, it stopped. The silence returned, abrupt and sharp, as though the world itself had paused. I forced my eyes open, my vision swimming, the crypt now bathed in a dim red glow that seemed to bleed from the walls themselves. The altar was gone, destroyed, and at the center of it all, something rose. It was formless, shifting, its body made of shadows that stretched and rippled like smoke. But its presence was undeniable. It loomed, filling the crypt, spilling into every corner of the room. There was no face, nothing human to look at, but I knew it was staring at us, watching, waiting. Josh screamed something unintelligible and staggered forward, swinging the crowbar in a wild, desperate arc. The weapon hit nothing. The shadow swallowed it whole, pulling it from his grip, dragging him to his knees. Mia crawled toward me, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice raw, broken. "What do we do? What do we—" I didn't have an answer. The hum rose to a roar, and the thing moved. It wasn't walking. It wasn't crawling. It was pulling itself forward, its limbs flickering, its body shifting and snapping into shapes that made no sense. I grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her with me, as I staggered toward the doorway, my flashlight long forgotten. Emily and Josh followed, stumbling over stone and debris, the roar behind us rising into something unbearable. We reached the entrance just as the ground split beneath us. The earth cracked and crumbled, opening into an endless void, a darkness that stretched far deeper than the crypt itself. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I dragged Mia up the slope, the wind whipping around us, carrying that awful hollow voice that clawed at the edges of my mind. We stumbled out into the forest, into the cold air, gasping, choking on the mist that still hung low around the trees. I turned back once just for a moment. The hill was collapsing, sinking into itself, shadows pouring upward like smoke, spilling into the night sky. But it didn't stop. The hum followed us, faint now, but still there. The mist thickened, curling around the base of the trees, spreading toward the town. Mia collapsed next to me, her face buried in her hands. "It's not over," she whispered. "It's not over." She was right. The shadows were moving. They were everywhere, spreading through the trees, slipping into the air, into the ground, into us. We hadn't stopped it. We'd set it free. And it was hungry. The sun was sinking behind the tree line as we pulled into Ashen Mill, its light bleeding through the clouds like dirty streaks of rust. The road leading into town had been long and forgotten, cracked with weeds and blanketed in a fine layer of dust that the wind refused to touch. Nathan drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel, like he was afraid it might slip from his control. I sat next to him, staring out the window, watching the trees thin out until the first silhouettes of the town emerged through the haze. Ashen Mill looked exactly like the stories described, a town frozen in its own decay, as though the fire all those years ago had burned its soul away, leaving nothing but a husk behind. Buildings slumped against one another, their frames blackened and broken. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets. Signs hung from rusted chains, their words long since worn away. The town square, if you could still call it that, was a cratered expanse of cobblestones and ash, the remnants of what had once been a monument, now little more than jagged stone. I tried to shake off the feeling curling at the base of my spine as Nathan killed the engine. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the faint creak of the car settling. I hadn't realized how much I'd been counting on sound, on the hum of tires on pavement, the static of the radio, until it was gone. Here, even the wind seemed hesitant to pass through. We stepped out, our boots kicking up dust that hung stubbornly in the air. Ethan and Clara followed from the back seat, their expressions shifting from curiosity to unease. Ethan muttered something under his breath, probably a joke to lighten the mood, but I didn't catch it. My attention was on the building to our right, a two-story structure whose sign had rotted away long ago. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, shifting slightly as if moved by an unseen hand. It was small, barely noticeable, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I had pulled my jacket closer, even though it wasn't cold. The air was heavy, though, not humid, just thick, like something unseen was pressing against my skin. "Let's set up near the square," Nathan finally said, his voice louder than it needed to be. He grabbed his camera bag from the trunk and slung it over his shoulder, already looking for the perfect shot. I followed without thinking, stepping onto the cobblestones. Beneath my feet, the ground felt wrong, soft and brittle, like the ash hadn't settled after all this time. We spent the next hour moving through the heart of Ashen Mill, Nathan filming everything he could. The camera lens swept over broken windows, collapsed porches, and walls covered in scorch marks that had faded to shadows. Clara and Ethan stuck close, pointing things out: a collapsed bench, a rusted mailbox, a child's toy half buried in the dirt, relics that didn't belong in a place like this. But it wasn't just the buildings. It was the silence. In every town, no matter how abandoned, there's always something, The distant hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, the creak of old wood settling. Not here. Here, the silence sat like a weight, pressing in on all sides. It was so complete that I could hear my own breathing, the soft shuffle of my boots, the faint whir of Nathan's camera. Every sound felt wrong, like it didn't belong here, like we didn't belong here. And then I heard it. A sound. Faint at first, so faint I thought I imagined it. I stopped walking, holding my breath. It came again, clearer this time. A low, rhythmic tap-tap, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across wood. I turned my head toward the old post office. Its roof caved in and its porch half rotted away. My flashlight swept across the empty doorway, the light flickering slightly as I moved. Nothing. The windows were empty, the interior swallowed in shadows, but the sound was there, coming from inside. I opened my mouth to call for Nathan, but the words caught in my throat. The tapping stopped. Silence returned, deeper than before. I stood frozen, the beam of my flashlight locked on the dark doorway. I expected something, anything, to move, but it didn't. It just waited. And then, slowly, something shifted. It wasn't visible, not yet, but I felt it, the same way you feel a storm in your bones before the first drop of rain. A heaviness spread through the air, curling around my chest like invisible hand. The darkness inside the building looked thicker, as though something was standing just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for me to come closer. Nathan's voice jolted me out of it. "You good?" I flinched, my flashlight jerking sideways. The shadows inside the doorway snapped back to normal, like a rubber band pulled taut and suddenly released. I turned to face him, my heart hammering. "Yeah," I said quickly, my voice hoarse. "Just thought I saw something." He frowned, the camera still rolling in his hand. "Weird place. I wouldn't doubt it." Clara's voice carried over from the other side of the square. "Guys, you need to see this." We followed the sound of her voice to what had once been the town's centerpiece. The remains of a monument, its plaque shattered into pieces. She stood beside it, holding up an old rusted lantern she'd pulled from the dirt. Inside the glass was a dark smear, something thick and black that stuck to the surface. "What is that?" Ethan asked, his face scrunched with disgust. Clara shook her head. "It looks like soot, but it's wet." I took a step closer, and the smell hit me, faint but unmistakable. "Burnt metal." "Put it down," I said sharply. Clara froze. "Why?" "Just put it down." Her expression shifted, but she placed the lantern back on the ground, wiping her hands on her jeans. For a long moment, none of us said anything. The air around us seemed heavier than before, like the silence was growing teeth. Nathan turned the camera off, breaking the spell. "Let's wrap it for tonight. We'll come back in the morning when there's more light." Nobody argued. We gathered our gear and started toward the car. But as we left the square, I glanced back one last time. The lantern was still there, resting in the dirt. But now, it was glowing faintly from within, a sickly, pulsing light that flickered like a heartbeat. And just beyond it, standing in the shadows of the collapsed post office, I saw a figure. Tall. Motionless. Watching. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew it had been there. And it wasn't alone. The motel was a relic from another time, crouched at the edge of town like it had been left behind with the rest of Ashen Mill. Faded, peeling paint barely clung to the siding, and the single neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly in the night, its letters flickering as if it too wanted to give up. We parked the car near one of the units, the headlights cutting through the thickening mist before Nathan killed the engine. The moment the lights went out, the dark seemed to lurch forward, swallowing everything except for the weak glow from the flickering sign. No one spoke as we unpacked our gear, the silence hanging over us like a shroud. I kept glancing toward the town in the distance, half expecting to see that figure again, motionless, watching. I hadn't said anything about it on the drive back. I didn't need to. Ethan had noticed how quiet I'd gotten, and his usual smirk had slipped into something closer to worry. Clara wouldn't stop glancing over her shoulder. Even Nathan, who prided himself on keeping his cool, hadn't cracked a joke since we'd left the square. Whatever it was we thought we'd find in Ashen Mill, it wasn't this. The room was small and smelled like mildew, but it didn't matter. We'd planned to spend the night in sleeping bags on the floor anyway. Nathan flicked on the overhead light, a pale, flickering bulb that gave off just enough illumination to remind me how much I hated small room. The wallpaper peeled in strips, curling like dead leaves, and the corners were thick with shadows the light couldn't quite touch. "Tomorrow," Nathan muttered as he set down his camera, his voice breaking the stillness, "we go back to the square, hit the rest of the main street, and check out the factory ruins." Ethan snorted as he dropped his bag onto the floor, the sound loud and out of place. "Yeah, great. I'll pencil in getting chased by ghosts around lunch." He forced a laugh, but it fell flat. No one responded. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands like she wasn't seeing them. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet. "You all saw it, right? The lantern, the light. That wasn't just me." The room fell silent again, the words hanging heavy. I knew what she meant. I'd seen it too, that pulse, faint but rhythmic, like the lantern was breathing. And a figure, just beyond it. But I still couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. I didn't want to hear how real it sounded. Nathan shrugged off his jacket and grabbed the camera, flipping it open. "I'm pulling the footage before bed. Maybe the lens caught something we didn't." I didn't argue, though every part of me screamed that we'd seen enough. Instead, I stood and grabbed my flashlight, the weight of it grounding me. "I'm going to grab something from the car." "You want company?" Ethan asked quickly, his voice light, but his eyes serious. I shook my head, already at the door. "I'll be 2 minutes." Outside, the air was colder than it had been earlier, the mist thicker now, curling in lazy tendrils across the cracked parking lot. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping it over the ground as I moved toward the car. The silence was heavier out here, more complete, like the world beyond the edges of the light had simply ceased to exist. I popped the trunk, grabbing an extra battery pack for my flashlight. The metal latch snapped shut with a sharp clack that echoed too loudly. As the sound faded, I froze. Something was wrong. The air had shifted. I could feel it, cold, heavy, pressing against my chest like a weight. My breath fogged in front of me, curling upward before disappearing into the mist. I turned my head slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the parking lot. Empty, but it didn't feel empty. I heard it then. Faint sound, soft, rhythmic, coming from somewhere just beyond the edge of the light. Tap, 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 but, tap, but, like footsteps on wood. Slow, dot, deliberate. My pulse quickened as I turned the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam hit nothing. Just empty space and mist. The tapping grew louder, closer. I stepped back, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the dark. The beam flickered, just for a second, and in that instant I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the lot, barely visible through the mist. It wasn't moving. It just stood there, tall and thin, its arms hanging limp at its sides. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet refused to move. The flashlight flickered again, and the figure was closer. I gasped, stumbling back as my flashlight hit the ground, spinning wildly. The beam danced across the mist, and for one horrible moment, I saw its face, or what should have been its face. There was nothing there. Just smooth, blackened skin, as though it had been burned away. The light sputtered, the bulb struggling. The tapping stopped. Silence. I snatched up the flashlight, spinning toward the motel door. The handle rattled under my grip as I yanked it open, and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. My back hit the door, my chest heaving, the flashlight beam jerking wildly as I scanned the room. Nathan, Ethan, and Clara stared at me. "What the hell happened?" Nathan asked, standing. I couldn't speak. My throat felt raw, the words stuck. My mind replayed the tapping, the figure, that face, if I could even call it that. Ethan stepped closer. "What did you see?" I shook my head, finally forcing the words out. "There's something out there, in the mist. It's watching us." Nathan grabbed the camera, flipping the viewfinder open again. "If something's out there, I'll see it. The lens catches things we can't." I didn't stop him, though I wanted to. He aimed the camera at the window, its cracked blinds letting in slivers of gray mist from outside. The room fell quiet, except for the faint whir of the camera. Nathan's eyes narrowed as he focused on something. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't answer. He just turned the camera around, angling it so we could all see the screen. My stomach dropped. In the corner of the window, barely visible through the mist, stood a shape, tall and thin, its face nothing but smooth, burned skin. It wasn't looking into the window. It was looking at us. The camera sputtered, and the screen cut to black. And somewhere outside, the tapping began again. Tap, tap, bit, tap, battle. The tapping followed us into the night, a slow and rhythmic pulse that refused to leave my ears. I couldn't sleep. None of us could. The small motel room felt like a coffin, the air heavy and stagnant, filled with the sound of our uneasy breathing. Nathan had turned off the camera, but its lingering image burned into all of us. The figure outside the window, barely visible through the mist, its smooth face watching us with something far worse than curiosity. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands gripping my flashlight so tightly the metal dug into my palms. Every so often, my gaze flicked to the window, where the blinds swayed faintly as though a breeze was brushing against them. But the air outside was still. The tapping had stopped an hour ago, but I still heard it, faint and far away, echoing in the back of my skull like a metronome counting down to something. Ethan hadn't moved from the corner of the room. He sat with his back pressed against the wall, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the door as though waiting for it to swing open. Clara was on the floor beside him, her arms wrapped around herself, her head down. Nathan paced back and forth, chewing his thumbnail, the camera slung over his shoulder like a weight he couldn't let go of. The clock on the nightstand read 3:27 a.m. It hadn't changed since we arrived. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. "We can't stay here." His voice was low, strained, as though he didn't want the walls to hear. He glanced at each of us in turn, his face pale and drawn. "Whatever's out there, it's not just some story. You saw it. You felt it. We have to figure out what's happening here." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, his voice hoarse. "Figure it out? Are you kidding me? Did you not see that thing? I'm not playing ghost hunter anymore. I want out. I want out now." Nathan shook his head. "And go where? You think that thing is just going to let us leave? We're in this now. You felt it, same as I did. The moment we stepped into this town, something woke up." He wasn't wrong. I could feel it too, that pull, like an invisible hook, buried deep in my chest, tethering me to Ashen Mill. The town didn't want us to leave. It wanted us here, stumbling through the dark, looking for answers that would only dig us deeper. I stood, my voice steadier than I felt. "The factory. That's where it started, right? That's where we need to go." Nathan nodded. "The fire, the disappearances, it all came from there. If there's any chance of understanding this, we'll find it there." Ethan looked at us like we were insane. "You want to go deeper? Into that place? Into the dark? Do you even hear yourselves?" Clara lifted her head, her voice quiet but firm. "We don't have a choice. It's not going to stop. You know that." Ethan stared at her for a moment before shaking his head and pushing himself upright. "Fine," he muttered. But when this goes south, don't say I didn't warn you. Yeah, what? The walk to the factory was shorter than I remembered. The mist had grown thicker overnight, swirling around our ankles and brushing against our legs like unseen hands. The beam of my flashlight barely made a dent in the dark, swallowed by the fog the moment it left the bulb. The silence was complete. No birds, no wind, no rustle of branches, just the soft shuffle of our footsteps and the faint hum of the factory ahead, like a heartbeat under the earth. The factory ruins loomed out of the mist like a sleeping giant, its skeletal frame blackened and broken, its windows shattered. A rusted smokestack jutted into the sky, disappearing into the low clouds like an accusing finger. The fire had gutted the place a century ago, but it felt like the flames had never really left. The air around it was warmer, tinged with the faint smell of ash and something metallic. Nathan led the way, his flashlight cutting a thin path across the cracked ground. We passed through the entrance, a jagged doorway where the doors had long since been torn away, and stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, the warm air vanishing as though we'd crossed some unseen barrier. Inside, the factory was a cavern of shadows. The faint moonlight leaking through the shattered roof gave everything a pale, sickly glow. Machinery sat rusted and broken, their edges sharp and jagged like the bones of a long-dead beast. The silence here was louder, almost suffocating. I swept my flashlight across the room and froze. Handprints, mawajistai. Dozens of them, burned into the walls and machinery, blackened outlines of palms and fingers pressed into metal, as though scorched there by unimaginable heat. They trailed across every surface, climbing toward the ceiling and disappearing into the shadows. Clara's breath hitched beside me. "What is this?" Nathan moved closer, his light shaking slightly as he followed the marks. "It's them, the workers. They never left." Ethan turned on him, his face twisted with fear. "What the hell are you talking about? What workers?" Nathan didn't answer. He stepped further into the factory, the beam of his flashlight flickering as though struggling against the dark. I followed, my own light darting between the burned handprints and the rusted machinery. The air grew warmer again, tinged with that same metallic tang, the smell stronger now, so strong I could almost taste it. We reached the center of the factory floor. A massive, rusted machine stood there, its gears frozen, its pipes twisted and broken. Surrounding it were more handprints, more marks burned deep into the stone and metal. But there was something else too, a hole in the ground just in front of the machine. A perfect circle, too smooth to be natural, its edges lined with ash. Nathan crouched beside it, shining his light into the darkness. "It's a shaft," he said quietly. "It goes deep." "How deep?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Nathan didn't reply. He just stared into the black, his face pale. And then we heard it. A sound, low and distant, rising from the hole like a breath exhaled from something far below. Tap, tap, body, tap, dot, I. The same tapping we'd heard before, slow and deliberate, echoing up through the shaft like a heartbeat. Ethan stumbled back. "We need to go. Right now." But it was too late. The air shifted, the warmth vanishing as the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in front of me, and the tapping grew louder, closer, until it was all I could hear, hammering in my skull, rattling my ribs. The shadows in the corners of the factory moved, coiling and stretching, pulling themselves free of the walls. From the hole came a sound, a scream, low and guttural, rising into something inhuman. And then it was there. A year, tall and burned, crawled out of the shaft, its limbs jerking and twisting, its hollow face turned toward us. The tapping stopped, and the factory plunged into darkness. The darkness swallowed everything. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was thicker, alive, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. I couldn't see my feet, couldn't see Nathan, Clara, or Ethan, even though I knew they were close. My flashlight sputtered weakly, its beam reduced to a flickering glow barely strong enough to illuminate the ground a few inches ahead of me. "Where are you guys?" My voice broke through the silence, rough and unsteady. It felt wrong to speak, like the darkness itself might hear me. From somewhere to my left, Clara's voice trembled. "I'm here. I think I'm here." The tapping sound returned, fainter now, but steady. Tap, dot, dot. Tap, dot all. Tap, dot all. It echoed from the walls, from the ceiling, from below, vibrating through the ground. I turned my head toward the shaft we'd seen earlier. I couldn't see it anymore, but I knew it was there, open and waiting like a mouth in the floor. Nathan's flashlight clicked on a second later, the beam cutting jaggedly through the black. His face appeared first, pale, eyes wide with something just short of panic. He was breathing hard, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "We need to move," he said, his voice low. "We need to get out of here now." Ethan let out a strangled sound somewhere to my right, half a whimper, half a curse. "What was that thing? You saw it, right? You saw it crawl out." I didn't answer because I didn't know what to say. I had seen it. Something had crawled from that shaft, its limbs jerking unnaturally, as though it didn't belong to this world. Its body had been blackened, its movements wrong, its face a hollow void that sucked the light out of the air. I had only seen it for a split second before my flashlight failed, but it had been enough. Enough to know that it hadn't come alone. The tapping grew louder. It wasn't distant anymore. It was moving, closer, faster, like it was searching for us. Nathan swung his flashlight across the factory, its beam catching the edges of machinery and broken rafters. "This way," he barked, his voice snapping us into motion. I stumbled forward, keeping my flashlight pointed at the floor. I didn't dare look into the dark corners of the room. Every instinct told me not to. My boots crunched over broken glass and ash as I followed Nathan's beam, feeling more than seeing Ethan and Clara moving close behind me. The factory seemed bigger now. The walls stretched endlessly into the dark, and the ceiling felt higher, almost infinite, like the building was growing around us. The hum we'd heard earlier, the low rhythmic thrum, vibrated through the floor, growing louder, deeper, as though the very ground beneath us was breathing. Clara let out a small cry behind me, and I whipped around. "What? What happened?" Her flashlight trembled, pointed at one of the rusted machines. I followed the beam. There, burned into the metal, was a face. It was faint, distorted, like it had been melted into the surface, a hollow expression frozen in agony. "Keep moving," Nathan said, his voice sharp. "Don't look at it, just keep moving." We reached a doorway on the far side of the factory, its frame warped and blackened from the fire decades ago. Nathan stepped through first, sweeping his flashlight into the next room, a narrow hallway that stretched ahead, lined with old offices. The windows were shattered, the doors torn off their hinges. We filed in after him, the tapping sound following us like footsteps echoing down a long corridor. It was faster now, louder, like whatever was in the dark was closing the distance. I glanced back over my shoulder and froze. The hallway behind us had changed. The doorway we'd come through was gone, swallowed by the dark. The walls were closer now, the broken glass from the windows replaced by black voids that seemed to breathe. Shapes shifted within them, faint outlines of things that watched us from just beyond the light. Nathan's flashlight beam jerked upward as he noticed the change, and I heard him whisper, almost to himself, "It's moving. The factory is moving." The words made my skin crawl, but I didn't doubt him. The walls pressed closer, and the air felt thicker, hot and suffocating, tinged with that awful smell of burned metal. We pushed forward, the hallway stretching longer than it should have, the tapping sound growing louder with every step. Suddenly, Ethan froze ahead of me, his flashlight pointed at one of the office doors. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I stopped, straining to listen. At first I heard nothing but the tapping, rhythmic and steady. Then it shifted. Beneath it came a faint sound, soft and muffled, like a voice. Help me. The words were faint, almost a breath, but I heard them. Ethan turned to us, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. Someone's in there. I heard them. No, I said quickly. There's no one here. It's not real. But Ethan was already moving, his flashlight swinging wildly as he stepped toward the office door. The voice came again. Help me. A hollow, broken plea that scraped against my mind like nails on glass. Ethan, stop! Clara cried, but it was too late. He grabbed the edge of the door, and before I could reach him, he pulled it open. The tapping stopped. Everything stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, his flashlight beam swallowed by the darkness within. And then, something moved. A hand shot out of the dark, blackened, charred fingers that wrapped around his wrist. Ethan screamed, stumbling back as he tried to tear himself free. The shadows poured from the room like smoke, spilling out in thick, writhing waves. Nathan lunged forward, grabbing Ethan by the shoulders and dragging him back as the door slammed shut with a deafening crack. Ethan collapsed to the ground, gasping, clutching his wrist. What the hell was that? He choked out, his voice shaking. Nathan didn't answer. He grabbed Ethan's arm, shining his flashlight over it. Dark smudges were burned into his skin where the hand had grabbed him. Black, finger-shaped marks that seemed to pulse faintly, like embers under ash. We need to get out of here, I said, my voice hoarse. No. Nathan hauled Ethan to his feet, and we moved faster, pushing down the endless hallway. The tapping returned, louder now, echoing from every direction, above us, below us, in the walls. The whispers joined it, a low chorus of broken voices that surrounded us, pulling at the edges of my mind. We reached the end of the hall, where a set of rusted double doors loomed in the dark. Nathan shoved them open, and we stumbled into the open air. The factory was behind us, its skeletal frame disappearing into the mist. But the sounds hadn't stopped. The tapping echoed faintly from the building, rhythmic and steady, like a warning. We'd escaped. But the factory wasn't done with us yet. The cold air hit me like a slap as we stumbled out of the factory. My lungs sucked in the damp mist, but it didn't feel clean. The smell of ash and scorched metal still clung to me like a second skin, and no matter how hard I tried to breathe, I couldn't shake the sensation of smoke in my throat. Ethan sagged to the ground, his back against the nearest wall. The finger-shaped burns on his wrist pulsed faintly in the moonlight, like dying embers beneath his skin. His face was pale, his breath ragged as he stared at nothing. I couldn't blame him. I felt it too, that pull, that unnatural heaviness that dragged at my chest like an anchor tied to my ribs. Nathan stood at the edge of the mist, flashlight in hand, staring back at the factory as though waiting for it to follow us. It might as well have. The shadows seemed alive back there, moving behind the shattered windows and creeping up the rusted walls like vines. We can't stay out here, Clara said, her voice breaking through the stillness. She sounded exhausted, like speaking was the last thing she wanted to do. It's not safe. I wanted to argue. Nowhere felt safe. But she was right. Out here, we were exposed, standing in the shadow of something that shouldn't exist, with no doors to close, no walls to keep out the dark. I crouched next to Ethan, gripping his shoulder. Can you walk? He nodded, but it was slow and uncertain. I think so. Nathan turned back to us, his face hard to read in the faint glow of the flashlight. We need to get to the church. I blinked. The church? Why? It's the only building that wasn't burned in the fire, he said, his voice firm. It's the oldest place in town, and there has to be a reason it's still standing. If there are answers, they'll be there. I wanted to argue, to tell him we should just leave Ashen Mill behind and never look back. But I knew better. The town wouldn't let us go. The figure in the mist, the whispers, the tapping, I could feel them closing in. Whatever had started here wasn't finished with us yet. The walk to the church was longer than I remembered. The mist was thicker now, curling around our legs, slithering over the cracked pavement like it had a mind of its own. The flashlight beams cut through it in jagged streaks, but it didn't help. I kept expecting to see something standing in the fog, tall and still, its hollow face turned toward us. My skin prickled with the feeling of being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up with every step. Ethan walked between me and Clara, his burned wrist clutched to his chest like it pained him to move. He hadn't said much since we left the factory, but every so often he'd flinch and glance over his shoulder, as though hearing something none of us could. Nathan led the way, his focus locked on the faint outline of the church up ahead. It loomed out of the mist like a jagged scar, its spire twisted and broken, the wooden walls blackened with age. The stained glass windows were cracked, their images warped and shattered, but somehow the building still stood, untouched by the fire that had consumed the rest of Ashen Mill. The heavy wooden doors groaned as Nathan pushed them open, the sound echoing through the still air like a death rattle. The inside of the church was dark and cold, the air thick with dust and age. My flashlight swept over the rows of empty pews, their wood warped and splintered. At the far end of the room, the altar stood in silence, its surface carved with symbols I didn't recognize, sharp lines and spirals that seemed to twist when I looked too long. Clara broke the silence. "What is this place?" Nathan didn't answer. He moved toward the altar, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty space. I followed, keeping my light low, afraid of what might move in the shadows if I shined it too high. As we reached the altar, Nathan's flashlight caught something, a book, old and massive, lying open on the stone surface. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, the writing inside scrawled in thick black ink. The words were in a language I couldn't read, but there were drawings too, horrible, detailed sketches of figures with hollow faces and twisted limbs. "This has to be it," Nathan muttered, flipping through the pages. "There's something here, something about the fire, about the workers." Clara peered over his shoulder. "What does it say?" Nathan's fingers traced the symbols as he squinted at the text. "It's some kind of ritual, something to seal or bind. It says the fire wasn't an accident." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" Nathan didn't look up. The factory wasn't just a factory. It was a... He stopped, his voice catching on the word. It was a doorway. Something was trapped here. The workers, they didn't disappear. They were sacrificed to keep it sealed. The room seemed to darken around us, the shadows pressing closer. I looked down at the book again, my flashlight beam catching the edge of one of the drawings. It showed a shaft, just like the one in the factory, with a figure climbing out of it, its body blackened and burned, its limbs too long, its face nothing but smooth, empty skin. A chill ran through me, and we opened it. Nathan nodded, his face pale. We woke it up. Ethan let out a low groan from behind us. I turned and froze. He was hunched over, his hand pressed against the altar, his burned wrist pulsing faintly with light. The marks on his skin were glowing now, spreading slowly up his arm like cracks in glass. "Ethan," Clara whispered, reaching for him. He jerked back, his eyes wide with terror. "It's inside me," he gasped. "I can hear it. I can feel it." The ground beneath us trembled. Dust cascaded from the ceiling as the air grew colder, the hum we'd heard in the factory rising once more, deep and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something impossibly large. The stained glass windows shattered. Wind roared through the church, howling like 1,000 voices crying out at once. The shadows erupted from the corners, twisting and writhing like smoke as they poured toward us. I grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her away as Ethan screamed, his voice breaking into something raw and unnatural. Nathan slammed the book shut, grabbing it under his arm as he stumbled back. "We have to go." Ethan's scream cut off abruptly, and I turned just in time to see him collapse to the ground. The light in his wrist flickered once, twice, before disappearing entirely. The hum grew louder. The shadows moved, spilling across the walls and floor, reaching for us. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I grabbed Clara's hand and we ran. Through the splintered pews, through the gaping doorway, into the mist that waited outside. The church groaned behind us, its walls shaking as though the building itself was coming apart. The hum followed us, echoing through the town, deep and unrelenting, like it was alive, like it was calling to something. We didn't stop running. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't far enough. That whatever had woken up in Ashen Mill wouldn't stop until it swallowed everything whole. The mist seemed heavier as we ran. It pulled at our legs like water, slowing us down, seeping into our clothes and our skin. I could still hear the hum. It wasn't behind us anymore. It was everywhere, vibrating through the air, a low living thrum that rattled in my chest. The book Nathan carried was pressed tight against his side, its edges digging into his ribs, but he didn't loosen his grip. Ethan was gone. I couldn't think about it. I couldn't think about the way the marks had spread, crawling up his arm like black veins until he collapsed, his scream cutting through me like glass. I shoved the image out of my mind. He was gone, and if we stopped, if we so much as slowed down, we would be too. "Where are we going?" Clara's voice came from just behind me, high-pitched and breathless. "I don't know," Nathan shot back, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly through the dark. "Anywhere but here." It wasn't a plan. I knew that. But we didn't have time, for one. We stumbled through the thickening mist, past buildings that sagged under their own weight, their shattered windows staring at us like eyes. The hum followed, growing louder with every step, shaking the ground beneath our feet. Clara tripped beside me, letting out a choked cry as she hit the pavement hard. I skidded to a stop, grabbing her arm and hauling her back to her feet. Her flashlight rolled across the ground, its beam pointing at an old signpost, rusted and half collapsed. Ashen Mill Cemetery, 1 mile. Nathan turned to see what we were looking at, his flashlight beam flicking over the words. He paused, his face pale and slick with sweat. "The cemetery," he said, his voice shaking. "If this is a ritual, if this thing was sealed before, the answer has to be there." I stared at him, my stomach twisting into knots. "You think we can stop it?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "I think we have to try." The road to the cemetery was worse than the factory. The mist pressed closer, turning the trees on either side into dark, shifting silhouettes. I could hear them, footsteps, faint but steady, pacing just out of sight. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of them, figures in the fog, moving alongside us, their hollow faces turned in our direction. The hum was louder now. It rose from the ground like heat, crawling through my boots, rattling my bones. I gripped my flashlight tighter, forcing myself to focus on the road. The cemetery couldn't be far. We just had to keep moving. The gates appeared suddenly, rising out of the mist like jagged teeth. They were iron, twisted and blackened, the paint peeling away in flakes. Beyond them, rows of gravestones stretched into the dark, half swallowed by fog. A twisted oak tree loomed near the center, its branches bare and skeletal, like it had been dead for decades but refused to fall. Nathan pushed the gates open, the metal groaning loudly in protest. The sound echoed too far, carried on a wind that didn't exist. We stepped through together, the book clutched tightly in his hands. Clara's flashlight swung nervously from side to side, illuminating gravestones so old their names had been worn away. At the base of the oak tree was a circle, a ring of stones blackened with soot, their surfaces carved with the same strange symbols we'd seen in the church and factory. The grass inside the circle was dead, reduced to brittle ash. Nathan stopped in front of it, his shoulders rigid, his breath fogging in the air. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where they sealed it." Clara looked at him, her face pale. "What do we do?" Nathan flipped the book open, its yellowed pages trembling in his hands. He scanned the text, muttering to himself, his flashlight beam shaking. "It says we need to rebind it. Blood, ash, and fire. That's how they sealed it before." The wind picked up, swirling the mist around us in tight, curling tendrils. The hum grew louder, so loud it felt like the earth itself was vibrating beneath us. I could see figures now, just beyond the cemetery gates, their outlines faint and shifting, growing closer. "Blood?" Clara's voice cracked. Nathan nodded, pulling a pocket knife from his jacket. He didn't hesitate, just sliced a line across his palm, wincing as blood pooled and dripped into the circle. "It's just a drop," he muttered, pressing his hand to one of the stones. "That's all it takes." The stone pulsed faintly beneath his touch, a red glow spreading through its cracks like veins. I stepped forward next, my hands trembling as I took the knife. The cut stung, sharp and hot, but I didn't stop. My blood hit the ash and the glow spread further, the hum faltering for the first time. Clara followed, her face streaked with tears, but she didn't say a word. Her blood joined ours, and the light connected the stones, weaving a pulsing line of red through the circle. The ground shook. The mist pulled back suddenly, like a tide receding, and for a moment the air was still. I thought we'd done it. I thought we'd stopped it. But then the hum returned, deeper, angrier, rising into a roar that exploded through the cemetery like a shockwave. The earth beneath the circle split open. A black void stretched below us, deeper than anything I could comprehend, and something began to rise from it. Something huge, formless, its body made of smoke and shadow. The figures beyond the gates screamed, their cries echoing through the air as they collapsed into the ground, pulled into the void like leaves in a storm. Nathan stumbled back, his face frozen in horror. No, this isn't right. It's not stopping. The thing rose higher, its shape shifting and flickering. I couldn't look away. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. The air turned freezing, every breath burning in my chest, and I realized then, we'd opened it wider. Clara grabbed my arm, snapping me out of the trance. "We have to burn it," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar. "The book, Nathan, the book." Nathan's eyes widened as he fumbled with the book, his hands shaking too hard to hold it steady. The glow from the stones pulsed brighter, the red light turning black at the edges, twisting and curling like smoke. "No!" I screamed. Nathan ripped a lighter from his pocket, flicking it to light. For a split second, I thought it wouldn't work, that the wind would snuff it out before the flame could catch. But then, the fire leapt to the page, spreading quickly, devouring the brittle parchment. The effect was immediate. The hum faltered, splintering into something disjointed and broken. The thing in the void screamed, a sound that shook the earth and split the air, vibrating through my teeth and into my skull. The shadows writhed, shrinking back, clawing at the edges of the circle as though trying to pull themselves free. Nathan threw the burning book into the center of the circle, and the fire erupted, a column of light bursting upward, piercing the dark. The thing let out one final, shuddering scream before it collapsed, dragged back into the earth, the shadows screaming with it. And then there was silence. The mist was gone. The hum had stopped. The stones lay cold and dark, their glow extinguished. Nathan dropped to his knees, his breath ragged. Clara slumped beside him, tears streaking her face. I looked up at the sky, where the fire had burned through the dark. The clouds were gone, the stars visible again. It was over. But as I looked back at the circle, I felt it. A pulse, faint, and slow, like something still breathing beneath the earth. We'd won, but I knew we hadn't stopped it forever. It was still there, waiting. The silence that followed was too perfect, unnatural in its stillness. It pressed against my ears, filling the void left by the roar of the fire and that thing being pulled back into the ground. The stones lay cold and dead now, nothing but soot-streaked reminders of what we'd unleashed. The mist had evaporated entirely, the air sharp and cold, and for a second I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But I could still feel it. Faint, subtle, like a slow, heavy heartbeat deep in the earth beneath us. I couldn't hear it with my ears anymore, but I felt it in my bones, an unnatural pulse that had no right to exist. The others must have felt it too, because nobody moved. We just stood there, staring at the burned circle, waiting for it to move, for the ground to crack open again and swallow us whole. Nathan was the first to break the stillness. He dropped to his knees, the exhaustion finally hitting him. His hands were black with soot, his face streaked with sweat and ash. He stared at the burned remains of the book, the brittle ashes scattering in the faint wind like they wanted to disappear before the earth could claim them again. Clara collapsed beside him, her arms wrapped around herself as she rocked slightly. "It's still here," she whispered. "I can feel it. It's still here." I didn't argue. My skin prickled with it, the wrongness, the heaviness still hanging over the cemetery like a shroud. Whatever we'd done hadn't been enough. We'd thrown everything we had at it, and it had only been pushed deeper, back into the cracks beneath the earth where it had been waiting for so long. "It's weaker now," Nathan muttered, his voice hoarse. "We saw it. It burned. It screamed." "Something," I echoed, my throat tight. "But not enough." Nathan's head snapped up to look at me, his face pale under the streaks of grime. "What are you saying? We stopped it. It's over." I didn't answer. How could I? I couldn't explain the pull that was still there, its presence. It was fainter now, like a distant echo, but it hadn't disappeared. It hadn't died. It was waiting, watching, and worse, it knew us now. Clara shivered, curling in on herself. "It's not over. It's not over." Nathan turned toward her, his voice rising. "Stop. Don't say that. We burned the book. We sealed the circle. It's done." "It's not," I snapped, the words tearing out of me before I could stop them. My voice echoed across the cemetery, too loud in the stillness. "We didn't close it, Nathan. We just pushed it back down. That's all. It's still there." He stared at me, his chest heaving, his hands clenching into fists. For a long moment, none of us said anything. The wind stirred faintly, brushing through the dead grass, and I swore I heard it again, so faint I almost doubted myself. Tap, dot, tap, dot, tap, dot, owen. I turned sharply toward the gate. The mist had gone, but beyond the iron fence, the trees stood in sharp relief against the sky, their bare branches reaching upward like black veins. I swept my flashlight across the tree line, half expecting to see something there, a figure, a shadow, but there was nothing. Just emptiness. Nathan pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. "We're leaving," he said firmly. "We did what we came to do. The sun will be up soon. We'll get in the car, and we'll leave Ashen Mill behind, for good." Clara didn't move. She just stared at the burned circle, her lips trembling as she whispered to herself. Nathan ignored her, turning to me. "Come on." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from Ashen Mill as possible. But something wasn't right. The air still felt wrong, like a current pulling us back. I glanced at the circle again, at the stones blackened and lifeless, and I wondered if the fire we'd created had only served to stir what lay beneath. Still, I couldn't argue with him. We were broken, spent. Whatever fight we'd had left was gone. I helped Clara to her feet, wrapping an arm around her as she leaned into me. Nathan led the way back through the cemetery, his flashlight swinging back and forth across the path. We made it to the gates. The iron creaked as Nathan pushed them open, the sound grating and sharp in the still air. The road ahead stretched into the distance, clear for the first time. The mist was gone, burned away like smoke. I didn't trust it. Clara mumbled something under her breath as we walked, her voice faint and cracked. I leaned closer, trying to make it out. "What?" "They never left," she whispered. "They're still here." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. Nathan didn't look back at us. He just kept walking, his flashlight beamed steady as we moved down the road. Every step felt heavier, like the town itself was reluctant to let us go. The car was waiting where we'd left it, sitting at the edge of the road like a lifeline. Nathan yanked the door open, throwing the burned remains of his gear onto the back seat. I eased Clara into the car beside me, her eyes unfocused as she leaned against the window. Nathan started the engine. The sound was so loud, so normal, that it made my head spin. For a moment, I let myself believe we were really leaving, that we could drive away from Ashen Mill and never look back. We didn't speak as we drove. The road wound through the forest, the trees stretching overhead in a tunnel of twisted branches. I stared out the window, watching the darkness slip past. But then I saw it, just for a moment. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. Tall and still, its hollow face turned toward us. I blinked, and it was gone. The hum returned, so faint I almost didn't hear it, vibrating through the car like a distant echo. I turned to Nathan. "Do you hear that?" He didn't answer. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. In the rearview mirror, I saw Clara sitting perfectly still, her face pale, her eyes wide. She stared straight ahead, her lips moving soundlessly, whispering words I couldn't hear. "Nathan," I said again, my voice shaking. "The hum, it's back." He didn't look at me. He just stared straight ahead, his voice low and distant. It was never gone. I turned my head slowly, my breath freezing in my chest. The forest outside had changed. The trees weren't trees anymore. They were figures, tall and black, stretching up to the sky. They lined the road, perfectly still, their faces turned toward us as we passed. The hum grew louder, and then I realized we hadn't left Ashen Mill. Ashen Mill had come with us. The fog was suffocating, a heavy, swirling veil that blurred the outlines of the trees and muted every sound except the crunch of our boots on the gravel road. It wasn't supposed to feel like this heavy, this wrong. We were supposed to be laughing, ribbing each other about the ridiculous invitation we'd all received. A treasure hunt in Black Hollow, it said, scrawled in ornate gold ink across aged parchment. Whoever sent it had promised an unforgettable experience, and they weren't lying. The first sign that something was off wasn't the fog or the abandoned buildings that loomed like gravestones along the road. It was the silence. Not the comforting quiet of nature, but a dead, oppressive void. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the town itself held its breath, waiting. We'd arrived at what was once Main Street, though the warped wooden signs and sagging roofs told of decades without life. The invitation had been explicit about the starting point, the Black Hollow Inn. There it was, just as the map described, a hulking structure of rotted timbers and shattered windows. its front porch tilted like a drunk leaning into the night. "Who goes first?" Someone muttered behind me, but the words were swallowed by the fog. I stepped forward, the wood creaking ominously beneath my weight. A warped sign hung crookedly above the doorframe, the name of the inn barely legible under layers of grime. Pushing the door open, I was hit by a wave of stale, acrid air. Inside, the space was a mausoleum of forgotten lives. Overturned chairs, a bar covered in years of dust, and walls adorned with peeling wallpaper that seemed to crawl in the dim light. On the bar counter was the first clue. A leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age, lay open. The ink was faded, but the message was clear. What is sought cannot be claimed without sacrifice. A shiver raced down my spine, one I quickly attributed to the cold. Still, my hands trembled as I turned the page. Beneath the writing was a drawing of the town's church, its steeple looming like a finger pointing to the heavens. But the journal wasn't the only thing on the counter. Beside it was a small object, a pocket watch. Its face was cracked, and the second hand ticked in a strange, uneven rhythm. I shouldn't have picked it up, but I did. The moment my fingers closed around it, the air shifted. The oppressive silence was broken by a faint, rhythmic sound. Footsteps. I spun around, but the room was empty. The others were outside, still arguing about whether this was a good idea. The footsteps grew louder, not echoing but solid, deliberate, as though someone or something was circling me. My heart pounded as I backed toward the door, clutching the watch like a talisman. The fog outside pressed against the windows, distorting the shapes of my friends into grotesque, writhing figures. When I finally stumbled out onto the porch, the others turned to me, their faces pale in the ghostly light. One of them pointed at my hand. "Where did you get that?" they asked, but their voice was distant, almost detached. I looked down at the watch. Its hands were spinning wildly now, faster and faster, until they blurred into a single, ominous hum. Then the screaming began. It wasn't coming from us. It was from somewhere deep within the town, a high-pitched guttural wail that pierced the fog and made my skin crawl. Without thinking, we ran. The sound wasn't human. It was too raw, too primal. It followed us, growing louder with every step, chasing us through the labyrinth of decayed buildings. We didn't stop until we reached the church. Its doors were ajar, and the interior was bathed in an eerie glow that didn't come from any natural source. The air inside was warmer, almost stifling, and the walls were covered in strange symbols etched deep into the wood. At the altar was another clue, this time scrawled in what looked like dried blood. "You have called, and it has awakened." None of us spoke. There was no need to. The feeling was unanimous. We had made a mistake. Something was here with us, something ancient and angry, and it wasn't going to let us leave. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of decay. Shadows danced along the walls, though there was no obvious source of light. Then we saw it. A figure, barely more than a silhouette, emerging from the fog outside the church. It moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking with every step. Its face, or what should have been a face, was obscured by a swirling darkness, and its eyes burned like embers in the mist. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but we understood its intent. This was no game. The treasure we had come for was never meant to be found. It was a trap, and we were the bait. As the fog crept into the church, we realized too late that the doors had closed behind us. The figure stepped inside, and the last thing I remember was the feeling of my own scream caught in my throat, swallowed by the endless, suffocating silence. The darkness didn't lift, it shifted. That was the only way I could describe it. One moment, I was staring at the figure in the doorway, its burning eyes boring into me, and the next, the world seemed to collapse around us. The walls of the church groaned, their warped timbers bowing inward like ribs closing around a heart. The faint glow that had bathed the altar flickered, and the shadows became solid, slithering across the floor like living tendrils. We scattered. There was no plan, no discussion, just pure animal panic. I ran blindly, crashing through pews and clawing my way toward a side door that hung crookedly on its hinges. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one feeling like it might be my last. Behind me, the sound of wood splintering and heavy, dragging footsteps followed. When I burst through the door, I was met with the same suffocating fog, only thicker now, swirling in violent eddies as though stirred by some unseen force. The world outside the church was unrecognizable. The buildings, once decayed but discernible, were now twisted into grotesque shapes. Their outlines blurred and shifted, as if the fog was swallowing them whole. "Here!" a voice hissed, cutting through the haze. I turned toward it, my pulse pounding in my ears. One of the others, Jamie, I think, was waving frantically from a gap between two warped buildings. I stumbled toward them, my legs feeling like lead, and we ducked into the narrow alley just as the footsteps emerged from the church behind us. "What the hell was that?" Jamie whispered, their voice trembling. Their face was pale, their wide eyes darting between me and the fog, as though expecting it to lunge at us. I shook my head, unable to form words. My hand still clutched the pocket watch, its surface cold against my skin. The hands had stopped spinning now, frozen at an impossible time. 13:13. We didn't have long to collect ourselves. A sound like metal scraping against stone echoed through the fog, sharp and deliberate. It was close, too close. We pressed ourselves against the rough wooden wall of the building, holding our breath as the sound grew louder. I could feel Jamie trembling beside me, their shallow breaths almost louder than the noise. The figure appeared again, this time gliding through the fog like it was part of it. Its limbs moved with a jerking, puppet-like rhythm, and that same suffocating darkness swirled where its face should have been. But it wasn't alone now. Behind it, more shadows emerged, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. They moved in perfect unison, a silent, haunting procession that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. We had to move. I grabbed Jamie's arm and pulled them toward the other end of the alley, not caring where it led as long as it was away from that thing. The fog seemed to resist us, clinging to our clothes and pulling at our limbs, but we pushed through, desperate and wild-eyed. The alley opened into a courtyard, or at least what should have been one. The ground was uneven, the cobblestones cracked and covered in a slick black substance that reeked of rot. In the center was a fountain, long dry, its basin filled with a pile of objects that glinted faintly in the dim light. Jewelry, coins, watches, they looked like offerings, hastily discarded and forgotten. Jamie hesitated, their gaze fixed on the fountain. "What is this place?" they whispered, their voice barely audible. "It doesn't matter," I hissed, pulling them forward. "We need to keep moving." But as we stepped into the courtyard, the air changed. The oppressive silence was broken by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't a voice. It was many, overlapping and indistinct, like the murmurs of a crowd just out of sight. "Stay." The word was clear, cutting through the whispers like a blade. Jamie froze, their eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" they asked, their voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my grip on their arm tightening. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows at the edge of the courtyard began to shift. The procession had followed us, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they had all the time in the world. And at their center was the figure, its burning eyes fixed on us. The pocket watch in my hand began to tick again, the sound unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent courtyard. The hands were moving backward now, the ticking growing faster and faster. Jamie's gaze dropped to the watch, their face contorting in fear. "What is that thing?" they whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My focus was on the fountain, on the glinting pile of offerings. There was something about it, something I couldn't explain, that called to me. Without thinking, I moved toward it, my footsteps sluggish as though wading through water. Jamie grabbed my arm, trying to pull me back, but it was no use. The whispers were in my head now, louder and more insistent. Offer it back. The words weren't my own, but they filled my mind, drowning out everything else. My hand trembled as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the watch. Its ticking was deafening now, each second a hammer blow against my skull. The figure and its shadowy followers drew closer, their movements slow but unrelenting. I didn't know why I was doing it. I didn't understand any of this. But some deep, primal instinct told me that the watch didn't belong to me, that it never should have left the bar. I stepped up to the fountain, my hand shaking as I extended the watch over the basin. The whispers reached a crescendo, a deafening cacophony that made my vision blur. And then, as the watch slipped from my fingers and clattered into the pile of offerings, everything stopped. The fog froze, the air around us heavy and still. The shadows halted their advance, their forms wavering like mirages. For one brief, fleeting moment, I thought it was over, that we'd somehow stopped whatever nightmare we'd stumbled into. But then the fountain began to move. The fountain didn't just move, it pulsed, as if alive. The pile of offerings trembled, shifting and clinking together like bones rattling in a shallow grave. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back, pulling Jamie with me. The whispers that had consumed the air moments ago were gone, replaced by a suffocating silence that somehow felt even worse. And then came the sound. A deep, resonant groan that vibrated through the ground as though the earth itself was in pain. The black substance coating the fountain began to bubble, thick and viscous, releasing a foul stench that turned my stomach. I didn't look away as it spilled over the edges, spreading across the courtyard like a living thing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted in place. Jamie's voice broke through the haze. "We have to get out of here," they said, their tone barely above a whisper, but sharp with panic. I nodded, forcing myself to move, but before we could take more than a few steps, the black substance surged forward, cutting off our path. It was alive. It had to be. The way it moved, slithering and coiling like it had purpose, made my skin crawl. The figures that had followed us into the courtyard, those shadowy, unearthly shapes, stopped at its edge. They didn't cross it, didn't even try. They just stood there, their forms flickering like dying flames, watching us with an unnatural stillness. The groaning sound grew louder, rising in pitch until it became a low, grinding roar. The pile of offerings in the fountain began to sink, dragged downward by some unseen force. One by one, the objects vanished into the blackness, and with each disappearance, the air grew colder. My breath came out in white puffs, the chill seeping into my bones. Then it rose. At first, I thought it was another figure, a person or some grotesque mimicry of one. But as it pulled itself free from the fountain, I realized it was far worse. Its form was amorphous, constantly shifting, as if it couldn't decide what shape to take. Limbs appeared and disappeared, stretching and contorting in impossible ways. Its surface was a writhing mass of black and gray, like smoke trapped in tar, and where a face should have been was only an endless void. The thing towered over us, its presence filling the courtyard with an oppressive weight. My lungs burned as I struggled to breathe, as though the air itself had turned against us. Jamie gripped my arm tightly, their nails digging into my skin, but I barely felt it. My entire focus was on the creature, on the way it seemed to study us, tilting its featureless head like it was curious. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, a vibration that rippled through my body, shaking me to my core. It wasn't words, not exactly, but I understood it all the same. It wasn't asking, it was commanding. Stay. The command reverberated in my skull, drowning out everything else. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees, the cold stone biting through my clothes. Beside me, Jamie let out a strangled cry, their hands clutching at their head as though trying to block out the voice. The creature moved closer, its form shifting with every step. The black substance trailed behind it like a shadow, spreading out to consume the courtyard. The figures at the edge remained motionless, their flickering forms becoming fainter, as if the thing's presence was draining what little substance they had left. My hand brushed against something cold and hard on the ground. Without thinking, I grabbed it. It was one of the discarded offerings, a silver locket tarnished with age. My fingers closed around it, and a sudden jolt shot through me, a searing pain that left me gasping. Images flashed in my mind, fractured, incoherent glimpses of a place I didn't recognize. A circle of stones, a fire burning bright against the night, and something else, something watching. The images faded as quickly as they came, leaving me disoriented. But the locket was still in my hand, and though it felt impossibly heavy, I couldn't bring myself to let it go. The creature loomed over me now, its amorphous form stretching impossibly high. The void where its face should have been seemed to pull at me, drawing me in. Somewhere behind me, Jamie screamed. I turned just in time to see them being dragged backward, their legs kicking against the black substance that had ensnared them. I lunged forward, grabbing their arm, but the force pulling them was too strong. The tar-like tendrils coiled around their body, twisting and tightening as they were pulled toward the fountain. "Help me!" they cried, their voice raw with terror. I held on as tightly as I could, but the substance burned where it touched me, searing through my skin. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes, the pain overwhelming. Jamie's grip slipped, and in one horrifying moment, they were gone. The courtyard was silent again, the black substance retreating back to the fountain, as if satisfied. My hands were shaking, my skin blistered where the tendrils had touched me. The locket in my palm felt heavier than ever, its presence both comforting and suffocating. I was alone now, alone with the creature that still loomed over me, its void-like face staring down as though it could see into the deepest corners of my soul. It didn't speak again, but it didn't need to. The message was clear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The silence that followed Jamie's disappearance wasn't empty, it was suffocating. My hands throbbed where the black substance had burned me, but the pain barely registered compared to the overwhelming sense of dread that seeped into my every thought. My breathing was shallow, each inhale feeling like it scraped against my ribs, and the locket in my hand grew colder, as if feeding off the despair tightening around me. The creature had retreated, or maybe it had never truly been there. Its form dissolved into the fog, leaving the courtyard barren and lifeless. The fountain, too, had gone still, the black tar receding back into the cracked stone. But its absence wasn't a comfort. It was a warning. I had to move. Staying in the courtyard felt like begging for the shadows to return, and even though every step was agony, I forced myself toward the only thing that still stood out in the distance, the church steeple. It loomed above the fog, jagged and crooked, like a fractured bone piercing the sky. My legs carried me forward on instinct, though each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was pulling me down. The streets were unrecognizable now, warped and twisted in ways that defied logic. Buildings that had once stood in orderly rows now jutted at impossible angles, their outlines shimmering like mirages. Doors led nowhere, opening into walls or collapsing into the black void below. I tried not to think about the figures I could see moving in the fog, their shapes shifting and melting like wax. They didn't approach, but their presence was a constant weight at the edge of my vision. When I finally reached the church, it was no better than the courtyard. The walls were streaked with the same black substance, and the air reeked of decay. The heavy wooden doors stood ajar, creaking softly in the wind that didn't seem to touch anything else in this place. I hesitated, every part of me screaming to turn back, but there was nowhere else to go. Inside, the church was a hollow shell of what it had been. The pews were overturned, some shattered into splinters, and the altar was a crumbling mess of stone and ash. Symbols I couldn't read had been carved into every surface, their jagged lines glowing faintly with an eerie greenish light. The air was thick, choking, as though the building itself was alive and breathing. I made my way to the altar, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. The locket in my hand seemed to hum softly, its vibrations matching the faint glow of the carvings. As I reached the altar, my eyes fell on a book resting at its center. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, but the pages inside were pristine, as though untouched by time. I opened it without thinking, the words on the first page seeming to leap off the paper. The language was unfamiliar, but as I stared at it, the symbols began to twist and rearrange themselves until I could read them. The text spoke of a warden bound to this place, a guardian of something ancient and unspeakable. The sacrifices, the whispers, the figures in the fog. It was all connected to this entity, this thing that had been awakened. As I read, the air grew colder, and a low guttural hum began to resonate through the church. The carvings on the walls flared brighter, their light pulsating in time with the vibrations in the air. My hands shook as I turned the page, desperate to understand what I'd stumbled into. The next passage spoke of a ritual, a way to bind the warden again, to seal it away. But the text was incomplete, the instructions trailing off into jagged, illegible scratches. The hum grew louder, and the locket in my hand burned against my skin. I slammed the book shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The light from the carvings dimmed for a moment before flaring back, brighter and more erratic. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath coming out in visible clouds. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to anything human. They came from the back of the church, where the shadows seemed to pool and writhe. My body froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. From the darkness emerged a figure, but it wasn't the same as the creature in the courtyard. This one was smaller, more defined, but no less terrifying. Its body was hunched, its limbs too long, and bent at unnatural angles. Its face was hidden beneath a tattered hood, but the faint glow of its eyes burned through the fabric, 2 pinpricks of searing light. In its hand, it held a staff, its surface covered in the same glowing carvings as the walls. The creature stopped a few feet from me, tilting its head as though studying me. My grip tightened around the locket, its cold weight the only thing anchoring me to reality. For a moment, the thing did nothing, just stood there, its labored breathing filling the silence. Then it raised the staff. The carvings on the walls exploded with light, the green glow blinding and pulsing in violent waves. The ground beneath me shifted, cracks spidering outward from the altar. I stumbled back, the book falling from my hands as the floor gave way. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. Above me, the creature loomed, its form distorted by the searing light. The locket in my hand pulsed again, a sharp, rhythmic beat that matched the vibrations in the air. Without thinking, I raised it toward the creature, the metal burning against my palm. The light from the walls dimmed, and for the first time, the thing hesitated. It growled, a deep, guttural sound that shook the walls, but it didn't move closer. The locket glowed faintly, its surface etched with symbols I hadn't noticed before. They shimmered with the same green light as the carvings, as though the two were connected. And then the floor beneath me crumbled completely, and I was falling, the world around me swallowed by darkness. The fall felt endless, the rush of air tearing at my skin and the darkness around me so complete that I couldn't tell if my eyes were open. My body twisted and flailed, grasping for anything to anchor myself, but there was nothing, just the cold, suffocating void. And then, with a force that drove the breath from my lungs, I hit the ground. The impact didn't feel natural. The surface beneath me was soft but unyielding, like sinking into wet clay. My limbs were heavy, almost too heavy to move, and my head pounded as if it were splitting open. I tried to sit up, the muck pulling at me, clinging to my clothes and skin like it wanted to drag me down again. The air was thick, humid, and carried a metallic tang that made me gag. When I finally managed to look around, my stomach twisted. The darkness wasn't total anymore. There was a faint light emanating from the walls, which were smooth and curved, glistening with a slick, pulsating sheen. They weren't stone or wood, but something organic. The surface moved, quivering in slow, rhythmic waves, like it was breathing. It wasn't just the walls. The entire space felt alive. I forced myself to stand, though every movement felt like wading through molasses. The locket was still in my hand, its surface now warm and vibrating faintly, as if reacting to the unnatural energy around me. The symbols etched into it glowed faintly, casting just enough light to illuminate the ground. It wasn't dirt or stone beneath my feet, but the same living, pulsating material as the walls. It was like standing inside something's stomach. A low, resonant hum filled the space, growing louder with each passing second. The sound didn't come from any one direction. It was everywhere, pressing against my skull, making it hard to think. I stumbled forward, driven by a primal need to get away from whatever this place was. The locket pulsed in my hand, almost like it was pulling me towards something, guiding me deeper into the nightmare. The tunnel narrowed as I moved, the walls closing in until I had to hunch over to keep moving. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and the hum became a steady, pulsing rhythm that matched the beat of my own heart. My chest ached, each breath a struggle, but I couldn't stop. Stopping felt like giving up, like letting this place consume me. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber, and my steps faltered as I took it in. The space was enormous, the ceiling stretching so high it disappeared into darkness. The walls glowed with the same eerie light, but here the pulsations were faster, more erratic, as if this was the heart of whatever monstrosity I had fallen into. In the center of the chamber was an altar, its surface slick and glistening, carved with the same symbols that covered the locket. But it wasn't the altar that made my blood run cold. It was what surrounded it. Figures stood in a perfect circle around the altar, their forms shadowy and indistinct, yet horrifyingly human. Their heads hung low, their arms limp at their sides, but their bodies moved in subtle, unnatural ways, shifting, writhing, as though something inside them was trying to break free. The hum in the air seemed to emanate from them, their movements perfectly synchronized with the pulsing rhythm. I stepped closer, compelled by something I couldn't name. The locket in my hand grew hotter, its glow brighter, and as I approached, one of the figures lifted its head. Its face, or what was left of it, was a ruin. The skin was stretched too tight over its skull, the features distorted and melted, like wax left too close to a flame. Its eyes were hollow sockets, but I felt its gaze pierce through me all the same. The figure took a step forward, and then another, its movements jerky and disjointed. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming to run, but before I could move, the others lifted their heads in unison. Their empty eyes turned toward me, and as one, they began to move. The locket's pulsing became frantic, almost painful, and I realized it was vibrating in time with the figure's steps. It wasn't just reacting, it was connected to them. Desperate, I looked around the chamber for any way out, but there was nowhere to go. The tunnel I'd come through had sealed itself, the walls now smooth and impenetrable. The first figure reached me, its skeletal hand outstretched, and I lashed out instinctively. The locket clutched like a weapon. When it made contact, there was a flash of light so bright it seared my vision. The figure let out a guttural scream, its body convulsing violently before collapsing into a heap of ash. The light from the locket faded, but its heat remained, burning against my palm. The others didn't stop. They closed in, their movements faster now, more frenzied. I swung the locket again, its light cutting through the nearest figure and reducing it to dust. But for every one I destroyed, two more seemed to rise in its place, emerging from the shadows that writhed at the edges of the chamber. I was outnumbered, and I knew it. My arms ached, my breaths coming in short, desperate gasps. The locket's light flickered, its energy waning, and the figures pressed closer, their hollow eyes filled with an unnatural hunger. My vision blurred, and I stumbled back against the altar, the cold, slick surface sending a shiver down my spine. As the figures closed in, the pulsing hum in the air reached a deafening crescendo. The symbols on the altar flared to life, their light blinding and searing. The locket in my hand grew impossibly hot, and before I could react, it fused with the altar, the metal sinking into the stone like it had always belonged there. The chamber shook violently, the walls rippling and convulsing. The figures froze, their forms flickering and distorting before they disintegrated into black smoke. The pulsing hum became a roar, a deafening sound that drowned out everything else as the light from the altar consumed the chamber. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The light vanished, the hum silenced, and I was left standing alone in the dark. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion. The locket was gone, and with it, whatever force had been driving this place. But I knew better than to believe it was over. This place wasn't done with me. Not yet. The darkness didn't stay silent for long. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling sound, like dry leaves brushing together in the wind. But there was no wind here, no air moving through this suffocating void. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was all around me, a chittering, scraping cacophony that made my skin crawl. Something was moving in the dark. I pushed myself up, every muscle screaming in protest, and stumbled toward where the tunnel had been. My hands searched for an opening, some seam or crack in the wall, but the surface was smooth, slick, and unyielding. The scraping sound intensified, and I turned, pressing my back against the wall, my eyes straining to see through the oppressive black. Then the faintest glow appeared in the distance, an ember-red pinprick of light growing brighter with each passing second. It moved toward me, accompanied by the sound of something massive dragging itself across the ground. My breath caught in my throat as the light grew closer, revealing the thing behind it. It wasn't a figure this time. It was a mass, a writhing, pulsating thing that defied description. Its surface shifted constantly, forming and dissolving shapes too fast to comprehend. Limbs, faces, mouths, dozens of them, emerged and vanished, a grotesque mockery of life. At its center was the light, a burning, searing core that pulsed like a heartbeat. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, pinned by the sheer horror of what I was seeing. The thing oozed closer, its shifting form filling the chamber with an overwhelming sense of wrongness. My chest tightened, and I realized I wasn't just paralyzed by fear. The air itself was changing, growing thicker, heavier, as though it was being pulled toward the creature. The altar behind me began to hum again, a low, resonant vibration that cut through the oppressive silence. The symbols carved into its surface glowed faintly, their light flickering like a dying flame. The creature hesitated, its shifting form rippling, as if in response to the light. For a moment, I thought it might retreat. Then it roared. The sound was indescribable, a deafening, guttural scream that reverberated through my entire body. The walls of the chamber trembled, the organic material, rippling and splitting, open to reveal jagged, gaping mouths that echoed the creature's cry. The altar flared brighter, and the symbols began to shift, their lines twisting and rearranging themselves into new, more complex patterns. The light from the altar grew stronger, pushing back the suffocating darkness. The creature writhed, its form fracturing and splitting apart, only to reform again. The air around it shimmered with heat, and the ground beneath it cracked and buckled as it advanced. I stumbled away from the altar, my instinct screaming that I couldn't stay here, that whatever this was would consume everything in its path. But there was nowhere to go. The altar's glow reached a fever pitch, the symbols blazing with an intensity that made my eyes water. The creature let out another roar, this one filled with rage, and surged forward. Its form collided with the light, and for a moment, the chamber was filled with blinding radiance. When my vision cleared, the creature was still there, but it was smaller now, its form trembling and unstable. The light from the altar was weakening, its once brilliant glow flickering like a candle in a storm. I could feel the shift in the air, the balance tipping back in the creature's favor. If I didn't do something, it would overwhelm the altar completely. My eyes fell on the book, still lying where it had fallen on the ground. Its pages fluttered as if caught in an invisible wind, the symbols within glowing faintly in time with the altar's light. I didn't know what I was doing, but I grabbed the book and flipped through the pages, searching for something, anything, that could stop this. The symbols on one page caught my attention, their shapes matching the ones on the altar. The text was incomprehensible, but the locket's absence left an ache in my palm, a reminder of its connection to the altar. The symbols seemed to call to me, their lines shifting and twisting as if alive. I pressed my hand to the page, and the book responded instantly. Light surged from the symbols, flowing up my arm like liquid fire. The pain was unbearable, but I didn't pull away. The altar reacted, its glow flaring brighter, the symbols on its surface mirroring the ones in the book. The connection was complete. The creature screamed, its form collapsing in on itself as the light enveloped it. The ground beneath it split open, a chasm of searing light swallowing its mass. The chamber trembled violently, and I fell to my knees, the book still clutched in my hands. The symbols burned brighter, their energy coursing through me, threatening to tear me apart. With one final deafening roar, the creature was gone, its form consumed by the light. The chamber fell silent, the tremors ceasing as the altar's glow began to fade. The book in my hands grew cold, its symbols dimming until they were nothing more than faint etchings on the page. I was alone again, but the silence didn't feel like relief. It felt like the calm before a storm. The locket was gone, the creature defeated, but the book remained, its pages filled with secrets I couldn't begin to comprehend. And the faint hum that lingered in the air told me that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The silence was heavy, pressing against my ears like a weight I couldn't shake. The glow from the altar had faded entirely now, leaving me in near darkness, illuminated only by the faint phosphorescence that still pulsed faintly on the walls. My body was wrecked, every muscle screamed in pain, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably as I clutched the book to my chest. Its surface was cool now, the symbols inert, but I could still feel something alive in its weight. I didn't trust it. I wanted to throw it away, bury it, leave it behind, but some deep, primal instinct told me it was the only reason I was still breathing. The faint hum that had lingered in the chamber was still there, but softer now, like a warning whisper just beneath the edge of hearing. The air was still thick, dense with the residue of whatever had been unleashed here. The walls quivered faintly, as though they too had witnessed the impossible. Forcing myself to my feet was a battle. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, and my head spun with vertigo as I staggered toward the far side of the chamber. The ground underfoot was soft, slick, and it seemed to give with each step, but I pushed forward. I had to get out. The walls began to shift again as I moved, forming another passageway, this one narrow and jagged. The faint light from the walls barely lit the path ahead, and shadows danced and flickered in ways that didn't make sense. I didn't think about where I was going. There was no destination, only the desperate need to get away from whatever this place had been. The tunnel twisted, spiraling downward. My breaths came in short, shallow bursts and the air grew colder with each step. The book in my arms felt heavier now, as though it was dragging me down, but I couldn't let it go. I didn't dare. My mind raced with fragments of memories. Jamie's scream, the locket burning in my hand, the altar's searing light. It all felt distant now, like a dream I was waking from but couldn't escape. The tunnel opened into a smaller chamber, this one eerily quiet. There was no glow here, no flicker of movement. It was dead, a hollow void that seemed untouched by whatever life had thrummed through the previous space. At its center stood a single object, a mirror. It was tall, its frame ornate and covered in the same symbols that had adorned the altar and the book. The glass was dark, reflecting nothing, despite the faint light spilling in from the tunnel behind me. My steps faltered as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but the pull was undeniable. When I reached the mirror, I hesitated. The air around it felt colder, sharper, and the hum I had heard before was louder here, though still faint and distant, like the sound of blood rushing in my ears. I raised a trembling hand and touched the glass. It wasn't cold or smooth like I expected. It was warm, almost soft, and my fingers sank slightly into its surface. The moment I made contact, the hum grew louder, vibrating through my entire body. The glass rippled like water, and before I could pull away, it began to change. The reflection that formed wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. It was a void, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed alive, shifting and writhing as though it was trying to escape. And then, from the center of the void, a shape began to emerge. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, indistinct and formless. But as it moved closer to the surface, it became clearer. A face, or something that resembled one, pressed against the other side of the glass. Its features were twisted, unnatural, with eyes that burned like dying embers, and a mouth that stretched too wide, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. It didn't move, but I felt its intent. It was watching me, studying me, and the longer I looked, the more I felt something inside me unraveling. My grip on the book tightened and I stumbled back, but the thing in the mirror didn't vanish. It stayed there, its burning eyes locked on mine. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a sound, it was a sensation, a vibration that pulsed through my skull, filling my head with words I didn't understand, but somehow knew. It wasn't offering me a choice. It was a demand. Release it. The book grew heavier in my hands, the symbols on its cover flickering faintly as though trying to resist. I shook my head, clutching it tighter, but the voice grew louder, its vibrations more insistent. The mirror rippled again, and the thing inside pressed closer, its shadowy form straining against the glass. The walls of the chamber trembled, the hum growing louder until it was deafening. Cracks began to form in the glass, spiderwebbing outward from the thing's face. Light poured from the cracks, searing and blinding, and the ground beneath me split open, sending me sprawling. The book fell from my hands, landing on the ground with a dull thud. The moment it left my grip, the mirror shattered completely. The thing inside surged forward, its form dissolving into smoke and shadow as it flooded the chamber. The air was thick with it, choking and suffocating, and I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. But the book didn't stay still. Its symbols flared to life, brighter and more intense than anything I'd seen before. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as they were pulled toward the book, their forms twisting and writhing as though fighting against some unseen force. The ground beneath the book cracked, and a blinding light erupted from within, consuming everything in its path. I shielded my eyes, the heat searing my skin, and when I finally dared to look again, the chamber was empty. The mirror was gone, the shadows were gone, and the book lay silent and inert on the ground. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Whatever it was, whatever power it held, I knew it wasn't meant for me. The hum had stopped, the air was still, and for the first time since I had fallen into this nightmare, the world felt quiet. But the quiet wasn't comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, like the pause before something worse. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I'd ever escape this place. I only knew one thing. Whatever I had unleashed wasn't gone. It was waiting, and it wouldn't wait long.